Yes, let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Welcome to Dollcast with Kelly Cadigan.
I know you guys are going to tell me I'm crazy, but I think all gay men would benefit from a gender transition.
Brianna Wu.
Do you know who Brianna Wu is?
It was people online.
I said you have Brianna Wu, so
I don't remember who she is now.
Skylar Bogart.
More confused on girls or boys would be a better fit for me. And when you're bisexual and you have the potential for either, you got to parse that out a little bit.
And Taj Toff.
Having your story heard, having people empathize with you on that kind of political level, I think is really hard to do.
It's the Dollcast. Mostly normal women.
Hey there, welcome back to Dollcast. I'm your host, Skylar Bogart, and this is a podcast where we dive into the human experience, all while having just a little bit of fun along the way. Today, I'm joined by my fabulous co-host, as always, Brianna Wu, our fearless maven. Hi, Brianna.
So good to see you. I do want to say the woman that recorded that intro, her house burned down in Los Angeles this week. So
oh my God.
we're shout out to Amanda Wynn Lee. We understand if it's going to be difficult for you to say Taft's name correctly in the intro for a while.
It's
so
never
we
gonna
understand.
happen.
Yes, I will fly out there and give her a mic to help her out. So.
I think eventually it's just going to become a running joke that is just totally wrong.
Yeah. Or you could change your name. That would help the show a lot.
Yeah, or I could just change the name. Yeah.
Oh, that's devastating to hear, though. Well, either way, we'll continue on and just persevere. You may notice that there's a new person here today. Kate, the lovely Kate, is filling in for Kelly this week. Welcome, Kate. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Sky. I appreciate it.
Of course. And
our girl Kelly Cadigan got engaged this week. She's doing engagement stuff today. So
very exciting.
She asked for the week off, and I happen to know a lot of famous people. So I know Kate, and I was honored. I reached out to her and I'm like, oh my God, please say yes. We don't have another host. And she said yes. So here we are.
I think fame is a lot to put on me, but no, not so much.
Oh, well, we're glad to have you here. So
famous in our minds for sure.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell people your story, Kate? So just so people know, everyone my age that transitioned looked up to Kate. Like there are any number of like gorgeous trans influencers today. Kate was the original super hot, gorgeous, cool trans influencer that everyone looked up to. She had an ultra famous blog. We're editing some pictures of her back in the day, like genuinely stunning, and was just super inspirational to most people my age that transitioned. So, Kate, it's a real honor to have you here today. Thank you.
I struggle with flattery. I don't know. I've never gotten over that. And I certainly didn't intend to be as influential as I was to that small group of people. But it definitely turned out that way. And I was thankful for the opportunity at the time.
So do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself? What have you been up to in the last 20 years, girl?
It's kind of boring, right? Like, so I disappeared from, in 2003. I kind of faded away off the public internet. And I still participated on some, private forums and had some friends and whatnot. But by 2006, I kind of went invisible and just disappeared, kind of purged everything trans-related and just got on with it. Got married in 2010. We've been together for 20 years, but it took a while to get married.
No.
Worked, traveled, lived. Kind of pseudo-retired in 2019 and started a livestock farm, as you do.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, it's wild. Until recently, trans hasn't really been a thing in my life. I just I literally went 15 years without thinking about it. So
what brought you back then? Because you're making, I don't know, quite a
gosh. So it was a bit of a midlife crisis, a little bit of like coming to terms with aging, and that triggered all kinds of emotional stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And so as I'm cleaning my emotional house, there's this rug in the corner, and I peek under that freaking rug, And there's all this trans garbage stuffed under this emotional rug.
Yeah.
And I was like, God, I should have probably dealt with that stuff like 20 years ago, but like, I don't know, let's start cleaning. And so I got online, I started like researching, I stumbled across some of you ladies, and I realized I didn't have a modern position on trans issues. I was clueless. It's so ironic, painfully so. And I was like, I got to figure this out. I got to get a position. And so I dug in, and I think now, a year and a half later, I think I know what I think. I'm open to change, of course, but yeah. So that's it. Aging, seasonal depression, and,
life stuff. Nice. Well,
So,
we're glad to have you, for sure.
Yeah, it's a real honor. I mean, if you don't mind me asking, what are kind of your positions? Like, I know you've been thinking through some stuff. Kind of, what conclusions have you drawn? How are you feeling?
Oh gosh, there's so many issues, right? Let me rewind. So I started transition in 1998, and back then there really wasn't much discussion. We all kind of figured it out on our own. In my case, I didn't meet another trans person for like 3.5 years after starting transition. So we really just kind of grew up in cis culture and just integrated, and that was our mindset. We wanted to get through it and get on with it. And I, not surprisingly, still kind of feel like that. I feel like transition is a medical process that we have to go through to survive. And once you're through that, life. And I've never had a trans identity, really. It was thrust upon me when I was like in the public eye a little bit, but like it's never been a defining thing in my life. So I have a trans experience. For sure. Does it come up at a doctor's office occasionally? Yeah. But that's really about it.
Yeah. Wow, that's so relatable. I feel like before I was like online and doing Dollcast and all these different just video opportunities, I was very much in the same boat. Granted, it was a lot shorter lived because I only started transition in 2018. But for those like couple of years where like I was starting passing and I was just moving about in life, like being trans just didn't matter at all. It never came up. It wasn't a big deal. And now that I'm doing more stuff online, it's like, it's actually in the forefront of my mind all the time. And I'm interacting with people and it's like, oh yeah, you're trans. And it's like, oh yeah, I guess so. But that's like kind of a small part of me ultimately. So very much relate with what you were saying, like through that process. I was just kind of curious. You said like with aging, was there like a milestone where you were like, okay, now it's like time for me to come out and speak more? Or is it like, was it more just kind of gradual waking up and this, like there was more momentum behind that decision to like be on here and like come out again?
Yeah, the groundbreaking point was a text from Brianna yesterday. No,
Brianna shows up and your life is just changed like that. I'm like Willy Wonka.
Yeah, it was amazing. She did the cane stick tumble and sorry, classic Willy, old person joke.
I've only watched the Timothy Chalamet version.
It was definitely more gradual. I guess it started with, so this might sound a little weird. So with aging, I dove into surgical solutions for not looking ancient. And I think some of that, like using surgery as a way to kind of using surgery as a way to become more comfortable with myself, I think triggered some of the old stuff as well. Like it was like, oh, these are old patterns that I recognize. And I was cognizant of it, but I might have leaned into it as well.
So I really understand that because, I don't mind saying $100,000 of, plastic surgery last year. And, part of that was anti-aging, but part of it is just, like my FFS, I had very early techniques with that. It wasn't, it didn't get me as far as I needed to go. And I think I look much better now. It's been really interesting for me because when I was through my 20s and 30s, no one anyone valued me or gave me opportunities because of my looks. I mean, I wasn't horrible looking. I just wasn't particularly pretty, and now, like, I find, having gone through this, like, I feel really good when I look in the mirror nowadays, which is really odd to happen in your 40s, like, where you're getting better looking as you get older. So I don't know. I think it's a challenge, and I don't think trans women are alone in facing that challenge as we age, if that makes sense to you.
I mean, it makes sense to me. I hate that I'm as vulnerable to it as I am. And I wonder if, growing up, feeling pretty, thankfully I have more in my life than that, but I wonder if, all right, let me give you a quick rewind. I went to Vegas in last January, and the last time I was in Vegas, I was in my 20s, and I used to think I was a rock star. So I'm in Vegas with a bunch of my old friends for 50th birthday parties, and I'm like realizing I'm invisible in this city. Like, no one notices me, and it just kind of hit me. And I was talking to my friend Erin, and she's like, "Don't you love it?" And I'm like, "No, I freaking hate it. It's awful." And it's just vanity, and it's just self-worth, and it's ugly, and but I think it's normal, unfortunately.
I do too.
Yeah.
I think it's very relatable. I mean, obviously, cis women deal with this as well, and trying to stay relevant. And I would imagine for you, it's like, because you were so, especially in your 20s, like, held up as like the ideal that people should shoot for. I can imagine that being really hard. What I love as I've gotten to know you is, and this is just me being honest, like, back in the day, I enjoyed your work, but it wasn't so much how you looked as much as I thought you were a really skillful writer, really struggling with stuff in a really personal way, and having an honest conversation that we just were not having 20 years ago. So I really love your work for that. And the reason I brought you here today is, like, look, obviously you're gorgeous, but honestly, I think it's because you're witty and smart and kind and thoughtful. And I think the entire point to Dollcast is kind of figuring out where we need to go as a community. And I think there's a lot of value in truth in what you've experienced. And, I want this next generation of trans girls to hear it and love you as much as I do. So welcome to the show, Kate.
The rare, raw honesty is really important, but it's hard to get at. Yeah. Because it's vulnerability. And you take someone going through transition, and it's the most vulnerable experience most of us have ever encountered and will ever encounter. And to expose yourself during that takes either exceptional bravery or exceptional desperation. And I think I was the latter. Honestly, I would love to say that I was brave, but I think I just had nothing to lose. Or at least I felt that way. So.
Yeah. So I guess I don't know as much about your transition journey, or you mentioned it was 1998. I was a little kid in the 90s, so I don't know as well about what that time was like, but can you just describe a little bit more, if you don't mind, how you figured out you wanted to transition, and what that journey looked like for you in 1998, where I imagine there was less access to medical procedures, and finding a doctor was probably harder. I'm just really curious, honestly, about what that was like.
Yeah, so we were a bit bereft of role models of successful integrated women.
Yeah.
Lynn Conway was a monstrous resource for me. She was perfect in that she achieved in her life and all that stuff. And I was lucky enough to get to know her and a few others that had gotten on with it and just were willing to give their time and energy to me. So that was monstrous. And that was really the breaking point for me, just having one role model, just one, that first person that I was like, oh my God, I can have a life. They were very rare back then. And that's what triggered me. And I remember, I assume that most people remember that moment where you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And that was December 1998. So it was late 1998. I had just started grad school. I was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And
Yeah, that's where my husband got his PhD. That's crazy.
yeah. So we were probably kind of there together. Maybe.
Yeah,
When was
probably
he?
around the same
All right,
time.
don't read
I don't know. Frank is older than I am, so I was kind of like, he's 12 years older, so he'll be talking and stuff. And I'm like, oh, I was in kindergarten, Frank. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I was pragmatic. Sky, I've actually watched a few of your things prior to this, and your sensibility is spot on with how I went about things. On the toe in the water, gradual, reversible, make sure you're confident, make sure you're aware. We waited 20 years, let's not go crazy, let's just be sure. And so that's what I did. I started immediately with like hair stuff, like removal and hormones. But of course, doctors weren't a thing. So I was black marketing. For 3 years, I black marketed and just kind of dealt with things myself. I did not go through, even though Harry Benjamin stuff was locked in at that point, I found my own way. And, but that was lack of availability. My doctor literally said, no, never.
Really?
And I said, at least can you like do my blood work? Like, if I'm going to do this black market, can you at least keep me updated on blood results? And he did that. So I at least had some data to adjust my HRT.
Oh my!
And then
That's fascinating.
3 years later, so I did this weird androgynous thing where I was like, I do not want to like flip the switch until I can flip this switch, which is kind of really dumb because by the end I just couldn't pass as a boy anymore.
Yeah.
I got FFS like literally 3 days after I went full time.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so
Who did your FFS? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I've also had some questions.
The only person.
Yeah. Who was it?
Osterhout, yeah.
Yeah.
Osterhout,
Wow.
okay.
You got the OG. Wow.
Yeah, the OG.
I mean, what are your options?
True.
Okay, so I have a question.
Yes.
Going from, realizing that you might want to transition to eventually flipping the switch to FFS, how long were you like in that in-between phase before you flipped the switch and had FFS?
3 years.
Okay. That's a decent amount of time though.
Yeah, so I had been hormonally female for a long time. I was binding
Wow.
to pass as a boy.
Boy moding for sure.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember thinking that, like, am I the freaking only trans girl on the planet to bind her chest? Like, what the hell am I doing?
Do you have any pictures of this? Because you must have looked, I'm trying to think of
Like a trans guy,
word.
probably.
Yeah.
Like a pre-transition trans guy.
Honestly, I could not pass as a boy. Like, I would be out in like shirt and tie, like boy mode, and like people would come up and go, "You are so beautiful," and I'd be like, well, "That is confusing."
I mean, that's quite flattering though, ultimately.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, of course, but I don't know if I heard it at the time.
Right. I mean, you never do. I mean, I don't know. I relate in so many ways because I think that I sort of came onto the internet and people like immediately were very interested in me because I was transitioning so young. And as I've like gotten a little bit older and there's just so many like beautiful trans women online and I've like removed myself a little bit, I've had your like Vegas experience where you just get like you just get less attention in general. And then you like sort of realize you're like, oh my God, actually I really liked that attention that I used to get. And so that can be sort of cognitively difficult to deal with. You don't really appreciate it like when you're in it, I think.
No, I didn't. I think it all just happened so fast for me. Like I went from oh, now I'm full time to being hit on by celebrities.
That's crazy.
Wow.
And being it was like a tornado in my brain. I didn't know how to process. And then you added the fame on top of it, like this weird, like, granted, it's internet fame and it's like 1990s, 2000s internet fame, but you roll that all in, and I was sloppy.
Yeah, it's sort of inevitable. But I will say, growing up on a later internet, so I was born in 2000, and so I witnessed a kind of transition in the internet space from there being trans women who I sort of idolized and who I sort of saw like occasional pictures floating by from, and there are images that are just like seared into my brain of like gorgeous trans women that you would just like see in the ether and then never connect with. And now I feel like the way we relate to the internet is so different. All of those people, I can like go to their Twitter page or their Instagram or whatever, and I am seeing like live updates on their life. And so there's so much more connection, and there really used to be like an era, I feel, of like a mysterious and enigmatic and like gorgeous trans woman who you sort of idolize but like feels so distant. And I can just so clearly picture you falling into that role for so many people.
Yeah.
I don't know if Bree can like attest to that, but that's just what I imagine.
Well, it was the fact that, how can I say this? You got to understand, for Kate and I, the image of trans girls was Jerry Springer, right?
Right.
So it would be some cross-dresser looking person, and you'd see Kate, and look, it's for me, I never had any like desire to be gorgeous. I just wanted to have a life where I didn't feel trapped all the time, like I had to act like a boy and people would treat me like that. Like I just wanted a boyfriend and a career. And I didn't want to hide what I was thinking and feeling all the time. I didn't want to look like some drag queen on Jerry Springer. So Kate was very inspirational to a lot of us, because it was like, look, you can transition and you can look normal and you can be normal if that makes sense to you. So, like you really were the prototype trans influencer back in the day.
I mean, there were a few of us, fair enough, but
were they now?
I mean, I think so. Like Taft, you were mentioning on the updates, and I actually, in a very like antediluvian early internet way, I tried to do that with a blog. This is before they were called blogs even. But like I updated every few days with a fairly, usually a pretty long story. And so people would constantly check in and follow me through my travels and journeys. I lived on the road back then, so it was always newness and excitement and all that. But yeah, so I tried to do that. And I think that level of engagement changes the calculation a lot.
Yes, you were really like a trendsetter in so many ways.
Yeah, she was.
I watched too much Sex and the City probably back then.
That show is super problematic if you rewatch it, by the way.
There's like, that did not age well.
You're like, oh my gosh, Carrie was actually a horrible person. Like, I kind of hate her.
I
so
kind of had that take back in the day, though. I didn't like her back in the day.
All right, well, Sky, do you want to finish introducing everyone to the show? We did the thing where we go off course.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we have Brianna, and then we have Taftaj, and she's joining us again, our muse, as always, our favorite co-host. And then we have myself, but sadly Kelly cannot be here, and so we have Kate filling in for her today.
Yeah, and Kelly has a very happy reason not to be here.
I know, that's so amazing.
Yeah, Kelly's made it. She's married to a straight man.
That's the dream. That's the dream.
Yeah, I think so. I rewatched Envy/Desire this weekend, and so I have like the old discourse on my brain: trans women and straight men. What are the possibilities? And clearly, there's some good possibility, because we've got Bree and Kelly both either married or set to be married.
I don't think it's that hard to find a straight guy. I really don't. I mean,
I found it difficult, but I think that if you're committed, you can make it happen for sure.
I think like the dating time for me was really ideal for it because there wasn't like the dating apps didn't exist. So you had to go out in real life and actually meet people. So, I would go out and just honestly go hit on boys that I thought were cute. It worked really well. And then, I guess if we go on a date and we click and tell them I was trans at that point, before kissing or anything like that, and they were honestly interested. So, that's how we used to do it back in the day.
You didn't get a whole lot of rejection. Like, I feel like I was like going to say, the couple of times that I've mentioned it, only like twice, both the guys were like, no thanks anymore. Like, they were over it. And I was like, oh, okay. But I was just kind of like, whatever about it. Cause for me, it was a bonus fling. So it wasn't like an essential thing. But it has been it's definitely true that sometimes there's a risk of rejection when going up to someone like that. And I think like dating apps can kind of eliminate some of that risk by like matching you up with people that are already interested.
Yeah. How did you meet your husband, Kate?
It was, first off, I think I was ready. Like, I don't think you ever meet a spouse unless you're like emotionally ready.
Yeah.
It was random, so I'll try to tell it quick. I went to Best Buy, I needed a monitor. I was like, oh, I'll look at video games because let's lean into the trans video game cliche. Back and whatever. So I went through the video game aisle and I was like, oh, I'm going to buy this video game. It's like some Star Warsy video game. Fine, fair enough. I brought it home and it was like an online game. I didn't know what that was, but I was like, put it in and blah, 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 blah. Oh, there's people. I'm playing with people. And I meet people and we play together and it was awesome. And I met this guy and he ended up being my husband eventually, but we just played this game together for like 6 months, just in our free time. And then it became a phone conversation. And then he was in Santa Barbara. I was in Boston at the time. So it was Thanksgiving and I'm like, what are you doing for Thanksgiving? And I'm thinking about cooking a Thanksgiving lobster. So he flew out. All my friends were on speed dial because weirdo coming to visit.
Yeah, who knows?
So it turned out okay. And then we went, a few months later, I was traveling to England and I was like, hey, what are you doing for the next month? And so he took a month off of work and went to England with me. And our second week in England, I was like, ooh, actually, right after this, do you want to go to India for a month? And he's like, let me call my work. So we spent 2 months traveling the world together, and we're like, this is kind of working. Like,
that is quite a way to jumpstart a relationship.
Yeah. And then fast forward 20 years later.
So we were talking, like, for me, Sky was talking on how for her, the dating apps, like, you deal with rejection sometimes. How did, obviously I had guys reject me sometimes for being trans. How did you find that back in the day?
Okay, so this is going to be contentious. There weren't rules back then.
That's right.
So we were all trying to figure this out on our own. And so when I approached a relationship, disclosure was about what I wanted out of the relationship. So if I thought it was someone I could love, then transparency and honesty are paramount. And those discussions may not have been before all intimacy, but they were certainly before the big intimacy.
Wow.
But I had a lot of relationships where I just didn't.
I will admit to understanding what you're talking about. There were not really rules or discourse back then. So, it was a different era. I'll just say that.
Nowadays, the worst was I had, I called him my human dilator. I had a guy that I know so scandalous, and I feel like such an ass. I'm so sorry to the world. But I really liked him, and I dated him for 18 months, Wow. And I didn't love him. I really liked him though. And I still feel bad about that because, he's the only person from anyone that I've ever dated. He's the only person that I've left in the past. And the reason he didn't come forward with me is because of the lack of honesty.
Yeah.
And I guess I would encourage people to be honest, be upfront, tell your story. You don't have to use specific terminology or words, but you have to be true to yourself and true to your story.
Yeah.
And I wish I would have done that more often, but I didn't.
But don't you think that gets you like crammed into certain boxes, Kate? I mean, because today it's like a formula for running into, like, I hate this word chaser, but guys that are really, really interested in trans women and like objectify you about that. And it's like, if you want a relationship with a normal, like, heterosexual guy, like, he's got to like you for you in like spite of being trans, right? Like, my husband has never dated a trans woman, is not particularly interested in trans women, just clicked with me and appreciates me. And that's exactly what you want. I think today it's like these dating apps, it's like you've got to classify and disclose so early on that it's a trap. So I actually feel really sorry for trans girls nowadays.
I do now as well. I do not have advice, though. I just, 2 decades of monogamy, I'm clueless on how to date. I wouldn't have a clue. But it does seem exceptionally limiting.
It's frustrating for sure. I think dating apps have made it so easy to get casual sex, and a lot of young guys, like, that's all they want, right? And so if you're on a dating app in your 20s and you're looking for guys to date, you're going to find lots of guys who just want casual sex.
Yep.
And frankly, that's true for non-trans women as well. So our problem is like not even that unique. But then, as you get older, the frustrating thing that a lot of women find to be true is that whereas in their 20s they were able to get tons of temporary boyfriends, flings and whatnot, they get into their 30s or 40s, and if they're still dating, they realize that, like, oh, actually now it's way harder to find guys. And it used to be that tons of guys were just interested in sex, and now guys are just interested in a relationship, but they're interested in like younger women or like, very, hot women. And that can be really hard for some women. So yeah, it's not fun out there in the dating world. So getting a husband, and taking him to the end, that is definitely, I think you guys made the right move.
So be honest though, y'all. Don't you think the quality of men out there has decreased? Because I look at some of these 20-something guys and I'm just like, wow. Like, most guys when I was in my 20s had a job, So,
just drink more. You gotta drink more.
Yeah, I don't know if it's decreased, but it's grim, I will say. You have to sort through a lot of guys. And I feel like I have very high standards, which is another problem. Like, when I was trying to date men, before I found my partner, lots of guys who I was just not that into.
All right. How's the dating market, Ben? We're talking about the horrors of dating. How bad is it today?
Famous chaser, as we discussed last week. Oh my God. I hear that congratulations are in order for one of you.
Yes, for Kelly.
Yeah, for Kelly.
Yeah. Not here with us today.
Sorry. Oh, there's a new person. Hello.
That's right. This is Kate. She's uber famous. So.
She's filling in. Kelly's doing engagement stuff. So.
Oh, well, okay.
Mm-hmm. Ben, thank you for coming back to the show.
Hey, everyone.
Wanted to kind of get a little bit more detail on, I think, that you had published a story or a study or at least had talked about, something about 1 in 1,000 kids being on HRT, if I have that correctly.
By the time they hit 17, so they can just go on and do it, I suppose.
Wow.
Yeah, which is interesting because, part of what I would like to talk about is the framing of these studies, because if you tell one group of people, 1 in 1,000 children age 17 who have private insurance are on cross-sex hormones for gender transition. Some people will react like you all did, like, wow, that's a lot. And other people will say, we told you it wasn't that many people. So it's interesting how subjective these objective numbers can be, as objective as they might be in these studies. So what it was a study led out of Harvard's public health school. It was published in what's called a research letter in JAMA Pediatrics last Monday. And research letters are shorter. I suppose they must have very tight word caps. So you don't get a lot of the data that you might otherwise like. But in any case, case. It's peer reviewed. So what it found, they analyzed about 5 million data on 5 million adolescents, and they defined that very broadly between the ages of 8 and 17 years old, who had private health insurance. So in general, these findings are generalizable to people with large group plans. So, if people are on Medicaid or children are uninsured, and the uninsured rate, mind you, of children tends to be fairly low because of various federal programs in any case. But the rates in those groups might be lower. And I know that, Brianna, you and I have discussed how you think that the rate might be higher than what was reported amongst people with private health insurance because they might be getting it through the internet or whatever. But that's something that you can talk about.
Taff, if you had to guess, what percentage of kids today, because you're closer to it than I do, like DIYing when I'm in my private trans discords where there are minors present, it seems like there are a lot of people that are DIYing, or do you disagree with that? Would you have to guess it's higher, lower? How do you feel about that?
Geez, I have no idea how many people are DIYing. I mean, I reacted like, wow, that's a surprising amount of people. I know that lots of people, I think, massively overestimate the number of kids on HRT. There's like a famous clip of Matt Walsh talking to Joe Rogan, where he like wildly, by like a factor of 10,
he said
millions of people, which is just like, of course, like that's absurd. And so like, I don't know, as someone who has like a more realistic expectation for how difficult it is for adolescents to start this process in general, 1 in 1,000 seems like a lot to me. In terms of how many people DIY, I think it's going to be, pretty rare. Maybe like 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000, maybe something like that, right? Off by a factor of 10.
Do you think so? Really?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that like, it's easy to really overestimate these things. And I think that for every, 10 or, 20 trans kids who are getting HRT through private insurance, I think there's probably like 1 or 2, people who are getting it through gray markets. But yeah, I think it's probably easy to overestimate and probably not a huge number, but also not like, nothing to totally ignore.
Right. So in any case, keeping that in mind as a potential factor, what they found was that out of these 5 million adolescents, they started at age 8 because that's generally the earliest age of a normal puberty that isn't precocious. So they figured, for puberty blockers, they might start that young, and then cross-sex hormones maybe a bit later. So they found that overall that less than 1 in 1,000 children were on cross-sex hormones in particular. So that was the top line finding that was presented in the press release, and this was presented as being a very low figure. And so pretty much all the science journalists, quote unquote, in the major media outlets who reported this all just parroted that figure. Oh, it's less than 1 in 1,000. It's very small. But the problem is they were doing 2 things with that figure. One is that they were averaging it over time. And so are you able to share the screen with...
I will put the thing up in post-production. So people are seeing it on screen right now.
Okay. So if you look at over time, you can see, let's look at cross-sex hormones. So that's the blue line and the gray line. And the blue line is assigned female at birth, and the gray line is assigned male at birth. So the way that the study framed it was, no one under 12 got cross-sex hormones. Another way of saying that is people 12 and older got cross-sex hormones. So you can see how it's presented both in the press release as well as in this research letter, that it's being framed as, we told you it wasn't as big of a deal, but I don't know, are that many people really claiming that people under the age of 12 are getting cross-sex hormones? I don't know. Another way of saying it is like, this is something that generally is done largely by teenagers when we're talking about minors, and that over time, those rates increase, in particular amongst natal girls. So another way of saying it is, well, by age 18, what proportion of kids, had started these drugs when they were minors? And those figures were reported in the study. So out of 100,000 natal girls, about 140 in this group started cross-sex hormones by age 17. So that's 0.14%. And then for natal boys, it was 82 out of 100,000, so that's 0.082%. And if you put the 2 together, that means that by the time they're 17, about 1 in 1,000 kids with private health insurance have started these medications. But despite the fact that those figures were in the research letter, when you just report an across-the-board figure, over time. If you stretch that out down to age 8, it reduces the figure essentially. And then there are other things that might have raised it, such as we've discussed, or like they didn't report when they used a diagnosis code. It's a endocrine disorder not otherwise specified. So that's often done, like sometimes it's possibly done as a way of getting around various regulations, such as in Texas, the Texas Attorney General has sued a healthcare provider for doing that since they passed their ban recently, for example. So another thing, so they say that that advocates of these restrictive laws argue that the rates of gender affirming care are too high. We've certainly pointed to an example where Matt Walsh has done that, and he's been very influential.
We were just talking about this. Yes.
So, yes.
Yeah.
But if you look at, say, the Tennessee law that is under consideration by the Supreme Court right now, it explains like why they want to have the law in the opening passage of it, and nowhere in there is it saying that like lots of kids are getting it. It says the rates are increasing quickly, but mostly what it focuses on their concerns about harm. And so I find it a bit disingenuous for them to claim that that's like the main issue that people are talking about when they want these laws. So there's a lot of ways that this was just couched in a way to sort of hit a political point, and just. So anyway, I'd love to hear what you all think about this.
I mean, 1 in 1,000 still just seems like a lot to me, right?
Same.
Like, you know, I think that historically, especially like when I started transition, and again, this is what you're getting at in terms of the rates increasing. I just know that looking at social circles and the proportion of young trans women that I saw out there, it was like almost no one when I started to transition. And now I see that like pretty commonly. 1 in 1,000, I mean, at like a big high school, you're gonna have like a few trans women, trans girls, and that seems like a lot to me. So I think when I think about it in that historical perspective, I'm seeing the rates increase, and that's why I think people are concerned.
One other thing I wanted to mention is that, so this is covering 2018 to 2022, a 5-year period. And as we've seen from the Komodo data that came out that Reuters did in 2022, and Do No Harm issued a state-by-state analysis that came out in October. And all of those show that during that period, the rates, as to your point, were increasing dramatically. So if you only report the average rate over time, that's going to be lower than if you reported 2022. It looks like in 2023, the rates declined, pretty consistently, at least a bit. Wow. The rate looks sort of like an S on the side of a violin. It went down a little bit during the pandemic and then zoomed up, and then there was a bit of a retreat in 2023. There could be many reasons for that. I think it's possible that the doctors are becoming more reticent in the face of increasing lawsuits. They want to cover their faces. Possibly parents are reading a lot of information that makes them concerned and more reticent to consent to having their kids receive these medications. Who knows? But it's troublesome to me when a research letter like this is published with a specific political goal in mind, and then you can see the ways that they've done two things, doing average over a group of age and average over time, and those will both do this to the numbers essentially. So it could be, I'm just guessing, let's say it might be as high as 1 in 500 kids or with private. I think that would be an upper limit
currently.
Or 17-year-olds. So that's maybe the highest I would guess in 2022. But possibly somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5. And especially, I'm talking about natal girls in particular, because those are the higher rate. Boys, lower, natal boys. So in any case, the question is is that a lot or a little? Does this assuage people's fear or confirm them? And it really depends on who you ask.
Well, Ben, can I ask you a question? Regarding the differences in rates between natal boys and natal girls, does that indicate in your mind to a different cause of this gender dysphoria between the two sexes?
That's something that also gets elided, if that's the right word, in analyses like these and discussions, is the source of people's people's gender dysphoria and their transgender identification. There's the true transsexual is the term that is used a lot.
I hate that term. I hate it.
Whatever term you want to the traditional natal boy, natal male who since a very young age identified as the opposite sex or transgender, etc. Like couldn't stand being put in whatever clothes, etc. And then we have this new phenomenon that's happened over the last 10 years where we have a lot of natal girls who, after the onset of puberty, start to have gender discordance and express gender dysphoria, etc. So that's something that gets just sort of lost in the wash in these conversations. Where basically people just say, oh, well, there have always been transgender people. Like, yeah, but different kinds and from different sources. So why is it bad to talk about this?
Yeah. Kate, I wanted to ask you that. Like, tell me this is not just my memory, but back in the day when we transitioned, did you know any trans guys? Because I didn't. It just seems like something, like I look at this data, if you look at the chart, you've got 2 times as many, trans guys as trans girls. I mean, this is like, did you know anyone that was a trans guy back in the day?
No, I mean,
no.
The extent of trans guys was seeing Buck Angel on the cover of a magazine.
Yes. Yeah. It just wasn't a thing. So this is, I know they would probably tell you it's, I guess the progressive line on this is, you destigmatize it so people come forward, but I just don't find that a satisfactory answer personally.
Well, almost all the growth has been in younger people and natal girls in trans identification, the trans population in the last 10 years or so. Over 35, you don't see any growth. So why is that? Why is the older group not responding to these signals of reduced stigma in the same way that supposedly the young people do? Maybe they just sort of trench in their lives and it's too late for them. I don't know. But it really...
No, that's not how transition works. There are plenty of 40-year-olds had 3 kids and a career in the military that transitioned back. Kate, how many of these did you know? The guys that were in the army and they were cross-dressers and they suddenly came out and blew up their lives?
No, I don't think I knew anyone.
But but you heard stories, right?
But it was a thing. Yeah,
it's definitely an archetype.
Yeah.
And I can say that having written about HIV forever is that until very recently, when it came to breaking down subpopulations in various studies about HIV, trans men were almost never included because you could only get like 2. And so there was never enough for some sort of statistically significant result. So that's only a recent phenomenon where these studies have started to, cobble together the trans male population. Granted, they have different sort of risk factors. So they might not be as high a risk for HIV anyway. But that's, they were basically discounted because they were so rare that it almost wasn't worth the resources in studying that population in this context.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have a few more minutes because our next guest is running a little bit late, Brad Polumbo. So I guess, what is the, I mean, I wanted to ask, because this is the data we got after the ban, what ended up happening to these kids where you took away their gender affirming healthcare? I mean, what ended up happening to them? Did they get to continue it? Because I think that would literally destroy your life if you got used to being on estrogen and then you were taken off of that.
I mean, it's different from state to state. Some of them have been held up in injunctions. Some of them have been implemented. So everyone's waiting for the Supreme Court to rule in the spring. And then there'll be a process, whatever they rule, where that'll filter down to the other courts. So it won't be an overnight thing where all of a sudden it'll be legal or illegal in various states. But I mean, that is indeed a big question. Do they move away? But, I got pilloried for using this term on Twitter last year, but it's what's called a natural experiment. And it sounds unethical, but actually it's quite the opposite. A natural experiment is when you study the effects of something that just happened naturally. Let's say there's a natural disaster in one city, but not another, and they're very similar, and then you can study the impacts of that natural disaster on whatever it might be.
Laws.
Right.
Another example.
Like, for example, Craigslist rolled out in phases across the country. And so people studied how that impacted local STD rates. And they rose because of exactly what people were hooking up, for example. So I said on Twitter, unwisely, because I didn't anticipate how people would misinterpret me, but this was an opportunity for people to engage in a natural experiment to study how different laws impact young people. I mean, you'd have to be able to monitor them and have, various data sets, that sort of thing. So people thought that I meant that people were just sort of like, with this horrific Machiavellian intent, studying kids and watching them suffer. And that's not the point. You were just studying the impacts of something beyond your control. So in any case, wouldn't it be nice if researchers were attempting to study the impacts of these laws?
At the very least, we might get some data out of it, which will point us towards, how effective is this HRT intervention for adolescents?
Right. And indeed, what is it like to have it taken away? And I think I discussed this last time on the show, that Laura Edwards-Leeper, who was a psychologist, and she was a part of the team that imported the Dutch model to Boston Children's in 2007. And she's become a very vocal advocate from within this larger clinical community, advocating for more caution in the way that the assessments are done and that sort of thing. And she said, I asked her, what happens to these kids when they're in adolescence and they're told, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to get these medications. And from her work with many families of kids, either their parents won't consent or there's a law in the way or whatever it might be, she says the kids largely accept it and are able to deal with it. And that really speaks to a larger bias in our culture, which says that everyone is going to fall apart in some case of trauma, and there's no such thing as resiliency or patience. And that's not to discount that these things are very serious, but it is also nice to stress that people can cope with things that
yeah, but you're coping and you've got to, your body is perhaps permanently destroyed or changed in a way that makes your life
Well, it's
much
different
harder.
if you start. I wasn't asking about people who had started and then stopped. It was more asking about kids who wanted to start and had not yet, and then when are
right, but still, natural puberty is going to happen.
Yeah.
Your voice is going to lower. You're going to get a beard. You're going to be tall. You're it's, it will make their life much harder. The example I love to give is when I open my mouth, is tilted one way because of nerve damage from all the jaw surgery that I've had. I ended up in the ICU when they did my tracheal shave because I sat there in the hospital nearly choking to death. There was 3 days. That was not fun. So I hear what you're saying. It's always, I feel like we're close enough friends. I can say this. I respect where you're coming from because I think you're a straight journalist on it. But it's sometimes hard to hear cis researchers talk about this. It's so benign because you don't know the personal cost of it. And that's not to say we shouldn't do caution. I fully agree with that. I'm just saying it's so much easier to be oh, they'll be fine.
Right.
And I know what it's like see your body changing.
I think that when she was saying that, I think it's largely she's dealing with a patient population who are natal girls who come in when they're 14.
100%.
And they already have breasts. So the timing isn't as critical at that point because, they already would have to have top surgery anyway. It just means that they would delay it. So definitely to your point, I think that to what I was saying earlier is we need to differentiate who we're talking about here, what age they are, what perhaps the source of their anxiety is, et cetera, when we're discussing all these different ways that these laws impact people.
Definitely.
I wanted to ask you, someone was saying to me yesterday, I wanted to ask you if this was true, that my opinion, that as I understand it, there's no real rush for, female to male trans people to transition so early because testosterone will, I thought, work very effectively. Someone was bringing up to me that height is largely set from, before you've hit 17 and that you've only got a set amount of time after that where it's going to do anything. So if these F2Ms get testosterone early, does that affect their height trajectory? And can they end up because it would be very hard to pass if you're 5'3".
Yeah. I did see one study that I know of that came out very recently that suggested that I think it was, when you do have pubertal suppression that's early on when the growth plates aren't fused or whatever, that it can impact height. So, but I don't know as much about if it happens later, if you're
I will say,
go ahead.
My understanding is that testosterone will prevent height growth. So it actually leads to the fusing of those bone plates. And if you have high testosterone, it'll prevent you from growing tall. So if you have a lack of sex hormones in your body, if you just take puberty blockers, that actually causes kids to grow taller. So if you give children, Lupron, and they have neither estrogen or testosterone, which both inhibit height growth, they'll get tall. That's probably what happened to me. I'm much taller than either of my parents. I was on Lupron for a while and a very low estrogen dose. But yeah, I would say that it's not necessarily testosterone that will do that. But also interesting fun fact, I know that in Iranian culture, they will sometimes give their children puberty blockers early on to cause them to grow taller. So in like rich Iranian families, there's like an occasional practice of just like a little bit of puberty blockers so they get a little bit taller. Fascinating.
As a treat.
I've never heard that.
That's so crazy.
Fascinating. Wow. Yeah, I'll just say, when it comes to the study you published, Ben, and looking at that graph, it really wouldn't concern me so much if it was in the MTF population. But I just don't understand, like with the FTM and the rise on the testosterone, what is driving or like what is necessitating the treatment for testosterone in terms of like the risk reward balance of like with the trade-offs, because testosterone is such like a one-way street. It's like once you do it and you go through those changes, like we were saying with the deeper voices and such, you can't come back from that. And I've seen so many YouTube videos of detransitioned natal girls that are like crying because of their voices.
Yeah, pick up the phone. Sound like me.
It's heartbreaking. Yeah. As I just really, it makes me worry, like, is this going to cause greater backlash because there's so many, the proportion is so much more on the females than it is on the males.
Right.
And it's like,
Good
it's concerning.
I did find that the one study, there were two that I have to do with height. So this one came out in April of last year, growth and adult height attainment in Danish transgender adolescents treated with puberty blockers and sex hormones. So just skipping to the conclusion, it says the minor reduction in adult height of trans girls after hormone treatment may be beneficial to some, whereas trans boys did not experience height gain. So there you have it. And then there was another one.
Thank you for bringing that in.
This is early puberty suppression and gender-affirming hormones do not alter final height in transgender adolescents. So that actually found a different result. So maybe people aren't sure. Early puberty suppression and gender-affirming hormones do not impact final height, supporting the safety of the treatment. However, trans adolescents receive, what does FH stand for? Sorry, a final height in line with sex registered at birth rather than experienced gender. So maybe not so much.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on today.
Right.
We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Do you know Brad, by the way?
Oh yeah. Hi Brad. I don't know if you're.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, good. There's a deep voice.
We got it.
You have a voice for television.
Today.
Thank you.
It's a great show.
You do. All right. See y'all.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Yay.
Oh.
All right. Well, that was Ben. He was great. And now we have Brad. Hey, Brad. Welcome.
Hey, everybody. Thanks. Yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm going to do a little intro here. So rounding our guest lineup today is Brad Polumbo, a social media dynamo known for his independent commentary and sharp insights. Again, Brad, welcome to Dollcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and for that kind introduction.
Well, I've been a fan of watching your YouTube series on your podcast, Brad Against the World, or like, the one where you give all those sharp insights and commentary. So I just had a question for you. What got you into the social media space, or like what made you want to start creating content on like the radical takes that are just proliferating online these days?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting. I started out in more traditional journalism. So shortly after I graduated college, I went to work at a center-right magazine called the Washington Examiner in DC. And they were very interested in covering kind of traditional political stuff. I remember my boss going, "We should be writing about what's on cable news." And I said, "Well, what about what's on the front page of Reddit?" And he looked at me, and I'll never forget this moment, and said, "What's Reddit?"
Oh, no.
And that's when I realized that traditional media was not super long for this world, and that if I wanted to have a long-term career, I couldn't just pursue TV, radio, what I might have pursued if I was, entering my career in the 1990s or early 2000s, and I'd have to do something kind of different. So shortly after that, I started to dabble in YouTube and Instagram and TikTok, content creation, doing the same kind of thing, kind of commentary and opinion journalism. So based in facts and some reporting, but giving my perspective on things, but just in a multimedia form instead of the traditional writing columns and all that. And then my background's in economics, and I was a policy correspondent for several years. I didn't talk a lot about LGBT issues, but a year or two ago, as I had followed the discourse on it, and I saw things going off track. Really, I guess it's a lot more than a year or two. Time flies, but this would have been maybe around 2020. And I predicted that if things kept going the way they were going, that we were going to have a backlash and that the LGBT community would lose support for gay marriage, support for trans rights would all significantly decline, because I think that the movement was going too far, pushing into radical and unreasonable territory, and that Americans were at some point going to rebel against all of it. And I predicted that, was met with very vicious backlash by kind of the LGBT Inc. If you search my name on Pink News or any of those websites, you'll find very unflattering images and articles about me. But unfortunately, I wish I'd been proved wrong. I do feel I was proved right. But that's what I try to do with my commentary and my content, is provide an alternative to people to show that, one, there are many gay people who are not far left in their views and are people that you might, even as a Christian MAGA conservative, be perfectly content to coexist with and live side by side, to kind of push back on the terrible representation that I think the everyday LGBT person gets from Alphabet Inc. And then two, to kind of push back on the excesses to make it clear that we're not all like this, basically. So people hopefully don't fall into the black and white thinking mistake of thinking, oh, if I don't want biological males in women's prisons, who, even if they've done SA offenses, I must reject gay marriage, or want to ban trans people from the military. Those things don't have to go together, actually. And that's kind of what I try to explain.
So let me ask you this from the really beginning. And I want to ask you really directly. This isn't meant to be hostile. It's just so people can get on the record. So how do you feel about trans people? Just give it to me from the start. Like when you're around a trans girl, like when we hang out, right? Do you feel like you're talking to someone that shares an experience with you? Do you think our civil rights are important? Kind of just give it to me from the beginning. Like, how do you feel about trans people?
Well, it depends who you ask. If you ask radical trans,
I'm asking you.
And I will explain. I think it's interesting. The far right calls me a woke libtard who's pro-trans, and then the far left calls me a radical bigot transphobe. The truth is, I'm a libertarian, and my principles apply to everyone, including trans individuals. So I have, on the record over the years, repeatedly defended the rights of trans adults. I disagreed with Trump heavily restricting transgender people's ability to serve in the military. I said very simply, if they can meet all the requirements anyone else has to meet, and their doctor says they're fit to serve, so be it, right? Thank them for their service and be on with your day. But I have spoken out against things that I think are unfair or against basic common sense, like having no solid sex segregation in women's sports. I don't believe in kind of what I would call the alphabet people nonsense, the TQ plus, not just the traditional T. I'm never going to believe in neo-pronouns. Sorry, they're not real, they're not valid. But I've always been willing to use adult people's pronouns. I actually got in trouble, and this is funny. There was a transgender person who I worked with. I went to a very liberal college. I got formally written up by the student newspaper because this person identified, which actually isn't transgender, but that's a whole other category, as they, them. And I would typically, I don't believe in using they, them for non-binary people, but I also try to always be polite. So in that instance, I will try to avoid using someone's pronouns, and I'll just say their name. So I'll say, Nate says this, Nate says that. And I referred to Nate as the boy who cried wolf, but Nate was a non-binary identifying male at birth. Nate reported me, and I got written up and threatened that if it happened again, I'd be terminated for misgendering. And I'm like, bro, that's an expression.
Yeah.
It's just an expression. So the short version is I've always and always will support the rights of adult people to do whatever they want with their bodies. I've spoken out against Republican state laws that, for example, set the age at 21 or 25 to access medical transition. I'm like, no, these people are adults with human rights and freedom, and if they're old enough to do anything else. But I have supported restricting the age to irreversible treatments to the age of consent, so 16, 17, or 18, depending on the state. I've supported restricting participation in women's sports, though an interesting nuance that I have that I think people often miss is I've always fully supported trans men being able to participate in men's sports, because they're only putting themselves at a disadvantage. Seriously, if a trans man wants to play with me and the boys playing soccer, a trans man, power to you, because you're not putting anyone at a disadvantage. But there are some elements of biology that aren't completely ameliorated by hormone replacement therapy. Obviously, it takes away a lot of the advantage, but not all of it. And so that's something I've spoken out about. I've spoken out about the prisons issue, but I've also disagreed with bathroom bills. I don't think bathrooms are an issue. And I think policing who goes in what bathroom is far, far more trouble than it's worth into a basically imaginary problem that is.
I think if the four of us started using male bathrooms, that would be pretty disruptive.
Well, that's kind of the point I've always made, is equally disruptive would be forcing Buck Angel to use the women's room.
100%.
This is my critique of Nancy Mace. I'm like, one, the whole thing is grandstanding and virtue signaling, but two, the approach that she's advocating with no nuance whatsoever forces not biological males, but trans men to use the women's room. That's going to make women far more uncomfortable than a passing trans woman using the women's
100%.
room. So
Brad, I really wanted to ask
I hope that sums it up. I'm kind of the worst of both worlds or the best of both worlds, depending who you ask.
I want to drill down on this with you, because and I'd love to know what my co-hosts think of this too, but I knew I wanted to be a girl from a very young age. But I remember when puberty started kicking in, and I can read like gay, like, like stories of gay men and when they understood that. It's very, very much the same thing, right? Like attraction to men, trying to hide it, like disassociating in the locker room, all that kind of stuff, like just being really terrified by that. So I really want to hammer down on this. Like what I get is, like, Kate and I are a little older, and I think we remember a version of the LGBT community that was a little bit more together, or it felt a common sense of purpose. But I've always felt a kinship with gay men, because I think we are like similar to y'all with like an additional layer of complexity. But I feel like that connection has been broken. So how do you feel about trans women? Do you think do you consider us part of the LGBT movement? Do you consider us do you think we're gay men ultimately? Kind of how do you feel philosophically about us?
Well, I think trans women, and this is, I guess, some people consider this offensive, are at the most base level biologically male. And I think trans men are at the most basic level biologically female. I don't believe people can literally transform their sex completely. But I've always believed that people should be free to express themselves and live as the other gender for all intents and social purposes. To the core of your question, I don't really believe that the LGBT community exists. I think more accurate language at this point would be the LGBT category. It's a bunch of things that have been lumped in together somewhat incoherently or even contradictorily at times, but also it's just not a community in the sense, and maybe I'm too young to remember a better spirit of togetherness. I've just found it so incredibly hostile and toxic. I mean, to me as a right-leaning gay man, I've received a lot of vitriolic hate over the years from the far right and the groypers and the neo-Nazis, but I've also received intense vitriol and hate from woke gay men in particular. I was actually kicked off or basically excommunicated from a gay men's soccer club when I lived in DC, which has a very politically active gay community. I've always played soccer. I'm a lifelong soccer player. And it was interesting, their rationale was that somebody from Media Matters was somehow involved in the club, and he claimed that my presence on the team or in the club made hypothetical, there weren't any, to be clear, hypothetical trans members unsafe because of my opinions that minors shouldn't be allowed to transition. And there's a couple things about that. One, there were no trans people participating. I wasn't saying my political opinions at soccer practice. I wasn't bringing this up and causing debates or issues. And three, there's a very infantilizing view of a trans person, that they are somehow so soft and fragile that they can't coexist with a person who might have a different perspective than them without melting into a puddle, that I actually find incredibly paternalizing. Because my experience with trans people, legitimate trans people, not neo-pronoun fake people, is that they're actually incredibly resilient and have often endured a lot of hardship. And they don't need to be protected by woke gay men fighting for them to have a safe space. And it's often, I think, virtue signaling and activism where they're seeking to paint themselves as some sort of savior. But so I found the gay community or the LGBT community to be incredibly hostile to diversity of any more interesting or meaningful kind. And I guess the base of your question, I don't know if I feel that same kinship between the gay experience and the trans experience, because it does feel fundamentally distinct to me. I've gone back and forth on the question of whether it should be LGB or LGBT. I think it's a moot question. I think it is LGBT. I think people who are trying to go LGB without the T are fighting for a cause that the ship sailed so long ago. These are linked together. But I do think gender identity and sexual orientation are different things. I don't have any kind of common overlap with the sense of not feeling right for your gender, but I do have common overlap with the feeling something's wrong with you and trying to change it and trying to resist it. I mean, I can remember being like 12 and stealing the Victoria's Secret magazine out of the mail and like looking at it and trying to make myself interested in it and just it not working. And I can remember being 17 and simultaneously fully understanding, and I won't go into detail, but fully understanding what I was attracted to and that it was exclusively men. Also, having a girlfriend and not thinking of myself as gay. So this level of denial, of struggling to accept something with yourself that I think a lot of trans people experience, and that's why they ultimately transition, that I think is relatable and similar. But I do think sexual orientation and gender identity are fundamentally distinct concepts. I
think that's fair. I mean, for me, like my sexual orientation was almost incidental part of what was wrong with me, right? Like I was like, when I was trying to figure my sexuality out, I was almost agnostic. Like, okay, if I end up with girls, that's fine. Like, if I end up with men, that's fine. So I agree with you. It's a different journey. I know Kate has seen your YouTube channel and wanted to ask you some questions. So Kate, do you want to go ahead?
Absolutely. I'd love to push back on something, Brad. I've watched you for a while and I absolutely enjoy you, by the way. So the term biological, it's just like, this is a super pedantic thing, so take it for what it's worth. And I certainly wouldn't make a big deal to anyone, but you probably, because so the way I think about biology is certainly more nuanced than the way I think about chromosomes. So for example, when I think 46XY, that's very clear to me. But when we look at mammals and biological sex per se, it still is a Gaussian distribution around male and a Gaussian distribution around female, and there is overlap in the middle, especially around intersex conditions. I was born with disorders of sexual development and required like numerous surgeries in the first few years of life to normalize. To me, it just seems like there's weird biology there that causes all kinds of variety in development that deviate from conventional male and conventional female. The other thing is, man, in the fullness of time, I bet you anything that there's some biological causation for gender identity. We don't have that yet. We're not there, but we're learning constantly. I would not be surprised if it's there. I'm not searching for the trans gene, but I guess I expect it to be there somewhere. So that's my pushback. Again, it's a pedantic argument, and by no means would I march down the street on it.
Right. Well, let's talk about both points. The first point I think is totally valid. Obviously, intersex people are real and their conditions exist. I think what I would say is this: that the intersex thing, it often feels like a red herring to me, because it's often, and that's not to say it doesn't apply to some people, of course it does, but it's often brought up by people who are not intersex, or in a discussion of Leah Thomas, who's not intersex, to kind of just complicate a truth that we all know, which is that almost all humans can be easily categorized as either male or female. And there is a very small percentage where even the percent of people that are intersex, most within that can actually usually be identified as male or female, though there's just conflicting traits and other issues. It also depends how you talk about sex. I actually don't think about biological sex in terms of chromosomes anymore. I used to. I was discouraged from doing that by a good friend of mine, Colin Wright, who looks at, he's an evolutionary biologist and a PhD. He looks at biological sex in the terms of the shape of your gametes. And so there are only two sexes from this lens, because there's only egg and sperm. There is no third option. And everyone's system is oriented towards the production of one of the two, with I think like 0.003% or a tiny, tiny amount of people where that's not the case. Now, that's kind of like, to me, to say, well, sex isn't binary because of those exceptions. Well, I can flip a coin, and 1 out of 10,000 times it will land perfectly on its head. But we still think of a coin as having two sides. And so I think it's fair to say that sometimes the way I talk about biological sex is probably doesn't apply to a tiny slice of the population that's intersex. But it applies to almost everything we are talking about, and it's hard to discuss things with every possible carve out and nuance. And I feel that intersex is often brought up as a red herring by people who are, it's like, oh, well, why should Leah Thomas not be allowed to swim with the women? Well, Leah Thomas is biologically male. There's some unfair advantages there. She went through male puberty, whatever. And they're like, well, how do you know? So not everyone is male or female. Okay, but Leah Thomas doesn't claim to be intersex. Like, it's often kind of a distraction, I feel, from the question, because almost everyone can be sorted. But I do try to speak with nuance on these subjects. Sometimes I'm sure it fails to be captured in what I say, especially in short form formats. But intersex to me is like an explicitly medical thing, whereas gender identity is much more of an ideological concept, right? Or a nebulous kind of societal concept, and maybe psychological. Intersex is, to me, like hardcore. That's just a biological condition and experience, right? And how it just feels like so categorically distinct to me. And then I'm sorry for going off, but what was the second point that you asked about?
You know, I got lost in your eyes, Brad.
How about your eyebrows? Your eyebrows.
Thank you. I do get them
very iconic. Yes, we all do, I think.
I mean, gay men are just good at those things.
Yes.
I mean, like I said, I would not march anywhere with this banner. And honestly, it doesn't have a lot to do with policy positions. And gametes specifically seem a mile apart, but policy positions and the biological sex someone was raised in aren't miles apart. They do relate, and it's fair for 99% of people to speak with assumptions that are accurate for 99.99% of people. Right.
Yeah, I encountered this also. One of the things I also speak on is fat positivity movement, which I really disagree with. I was pretty overweight in my teenage years, and obesity is not related.
We had fat Brad?
Like at 13, yeah, you had fat Brad.
Give me some pictures of fat Brad.
Oh gosh, there are somewhere on the internet. I played World of Warcraft, and I sat in my pajamas in my own sweat all day and ate Cheetos.
Fat Brad, yeah. Wow.
Puberty helped, but I think when I speak about it, I'll say something like, if you're morbidly obese, that's a result of your choices. I acknowledge that there's a tiny sub percentage where that's not true, right? And I'll often say something like, with rare exceptions for medical conditions or thyroid disorders. But 99% of people in America who are morbidly obese, it's because of their sedentary lifestyle and it's because of the choices they make around food. It is not because of some rare thyroid disorder. And every time I talk about it, I have to go, pause. What, with the exception of people with these 3 extremely rare genetic and thyroid disorders? It's like, I try to throw that in there sometimes, but it is going to get lost. And I think for intents and purposes, I mean, my mom is probably the most loyal consumer of my content, or one of them, with my boyfriend. And she doesn't like when I speak in generalities, and I try to avoid doing so. But sometimes I'll say, like, Democrats believe this, or X or Y. And she'll be like, well, not all Democrats believe that. I'm a Democrat, and I don't believe that. And for example, I'll say, like, well, Democrats, elected Democrats want to replace the notion of sex with self-identification in federal law.
I don't know if that's so true.
Well, the Equality Act would do that.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's a longer discussion of how GLAAD and the ACLU, this is a whole discussion I'd love to have sometime, is we've essentially as a party outsourced our gay legislation to GLAAD and HRC and all these alphabet groups.
I'm just looking at
it's not... Yeah, it's just not
the Equality Act.
Sure, I'm saying the outcome is the same. I'm saying elected Democrats, I think, in my experience, because I write checks to politicians all the time. And when I talk to them, the first question I always ask is like, well, what do you think the top trans public policy issue is? And it's always stunning to me how little they've thought about it, Brad. Like, they don't know anything. They don't know the difference in non-binary
that I believe.
trans people. So I think it's just like the culture of the party rather than the people actually elected. I know Taff had some questions for you, so I wanted to let her answer.
Let me just say one quick thing about that. It's just that what I'm going off with that statement is the text of the Equality Act redefines sex under federal law and adds a parentheses that says, or self-identified gender identity. And most Democrats in Congress have voted yes multiple times to pass the Equality Act. And so I'll say something like Democrats support some form of self-ID, and my mom will be like, well, not all Democrats. And I'm like, that's true. Some did vote against it. But most Democratic politicians are on the record for this. And so I feel like generalizations have some context. That's the only reason I mentioned that.
Very salient criticism, and I think everyone on the show probably would. I think most of us think self-ID is probably not a good idea, though I don't want to speak for my co-host, so I think that's a salient criticism. Kath, what did you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I relate so much to your story. I feel like I also saw the trans community and the LGBT community kind of go off the rails with their messaging. And it's been really scary because for me, the core rights that are essential to me as a trans person are bodily autonomy, control of my own body, and self-expression. And I think those are core fundamental rights that Americans can broadly get around. And I'm writing a piece about this for Reason magazine, which is a libertarian magazine. And one of the things that I think has happened with legislation, and not so much through like the Equality Act, but through civil rights legislation and the Supreme Court's rulings on things, is the government has really stepped in to try to regulate how people interact with each other. And I just don't think it's very good at that. And so like you're talking about your, gay soccer team. I think there's so many instances of that. In my article, I use this other example. I'm talking about a steel mill in Gary, Indiana. And this steel mill is using all of this like DEI language about inclusivity and transness and whatnot. I doubt that there's any like trans guys that work there, but if there are trans guys that work there, I'm pretty sure that they're going to be like some hard-nosed son of a bitch who can take a little bit of ribbing on the job site. And he doesn't need the government to come in and regulate what those boundaries are for him. And in fact, like by having the government say like, you can't engage with each other in this way or that way, there's this culture where the trans guy is sort of encouraged to go running to the authorities if anything happens, and people are walking on eggshells around him, which is probably, if anything, not helping his ability to integrate into that job culture. So I think I've been really frustrated by just the fact that, like, I think that different people, they disagree on these big questions about like, are trans women women? Do trans women belong in the women's restroom, etc.? I think that those things need to be negotiated between individuals and the people around them, the businesses that they are employed by. And it's really tragic that we've sort of forced one standard upon all of society when trans people themselves don't have a single set standard for what is or is not acceptable language. So I don't know. That whole piece very much resonates with me.
I agree with completely. And it's funny because I've always been willing to use trans people's pronouns, but I think the only thing that could get me to want to not to would be the government trying to force me to. I don't, this isn't so much an issue in the US because we have the First Amendment protecting our speech, bless up for that. But in countries like the UK or Canada, they've had some sort of pushes at governmental levels or university levels to compel pronoun usage. I don't believe in that. And I don't think I would, but a piece of me would be tempted to start misgendering people if they started to tell me I couldn't. Just because I'm such a believer in First Amendment freedoms and freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. Even in cases, I mean, one of the things I've talked about is I agreed with the decision to protect the ability of the Christian baker who refused to bake a wedding cake.
Yeah.
Because I always flipped on it and said, if I ran a bakery and somebody wanted to come in and have me print on the cake the Leviticus message about gay people, I would want to say no, but their religion is a protected class under anti-discrimination law. So I've always believed firmly that you have to have the rights, you have to offer and extend and protect and defend the rights of people that you disagree with or on the opposite side that you want for yourself. So I've always viewed things like that. But I do agree with you that I think that steel mill example is such a good one that if I remember actually, this is I went to high school in a rural Massachusetts town, and
Which one?
Bellingham, Massachusetts.
Oh, okay.
There was a girl in my grade named Jen, and one summer, I think it was freshman to sophomore year, could have been sophomore to junior, Jen came back as Jay, and no one cared. He started going into the men's bathroom, the men's locker room in gym class, and I just remember being I wasn't political, I wasn't thinking about this, I played basketball, I played soccer, I'm 16 years old, I remember just not caring at all. Yep. Now, if they had come in, and we had as part of health class, a pronoun lesson, about that everything can be a pronoun, that fairy pronouns, if we had, them showing us the gender unicorn, I can imagine my friends and I making fun of it, becoming intrinsically hostile to it, thinking it's annoying and dumb. But when it was just a person who we knew, who we liked, had no issue with, who was asking essentially nothing of us other than to let him live his best life, we had no issue with it. And this was a rural, a couple kids would fly around in pickup trucks with the Confederate flag. It was that rural in Massachusetts, even though that makes absolutely no sense.
I grew up in a very similar circumstance. In Colorado, people do the same thing.
Yeah, so I think there's a point to which when government or very powerful institutions try to shove things down people's throats, it engenders more resistance than it actually achieves in support. And it's much better slowly happening at a decentralized level. That's one of the things.
Let me push back on that just a bit, Brad, because, so I hear what you're saying, and I think all of us here would agree. A big part of integrating as a trans woman is not making a big deal out of stuff, helping people understand your stuff. I fully support a model where if you're not being gendered correctly, you first take that as signal. Am I doing things? Do I need to change my voice? Do I need to change my presentation? All of us here recognize that. But let's say you come work for my super PAC, okay? I hire you today to work for my super PAC and produce media. In every single team meeting on Monday, I'm like, oh, here's Brad, that F slur I say that in front of my whole team over and over and over again. And if you like screw something up, I'm like, oh, you're screwing that just like the gay men screw, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just making these inappropriate jokes again and again. It's a hostile workplace. Everyone there is super anti-gay or is just making you feel uncomfortable. I mean, do you think that there is I think in a private situation like that, do you think if you have a leader or someone on the team that's just incapable of treating a teammate with respect, something teams need to do their best work, I can tell you that as a team leader, do you think that's a point where it is reasonable to have consequences for that, something over the line where someone just will not behave like an adult?
Yeah, well, what you just described is sexual harassment, first of all.
That's right.
I think we can agree sexual harassment should be illegal, and is in a workplace setting.
Or fireable,
Yeah, or fireable at the very least. And I think what I would say is what I advocate for, because I'm a critic of the excesses of DEI, but what I advocate for is non-discrimination. So what you're describing would be discrimination. What I would say you shouldn't do is, what I'm saying is, this is LGBT Awareness Month at the company. Brad's our gay employee of the month, right? Like,
I die thinking
right.
of that.
So
Oh my God.
I don't think companies should be sending out free copies of white privilege or white fragility to their employees, and I don't think that's going to engender positive race relations at the company. But I do think they should fire someone who discriminates against black employees, who doesn't hire black people, right? Like, so what I'm saying is, don't force it or go over the top with it, but also ensure a fair and equal access to opportunity for everyone. I think that's the middle ground there. I mean, I'm sort of a libertarian at heart, so whether this is private mechanisms or government mechanisms, I've made my peace with the state of anti-discrimination law, and it's just a part of our fabric. As maybe in my utopia, everyone could just fire whoever they want for any reason. That's just not the world we live in. So I think the standard should be across the board, and I do believe that sexual orientation should be a protected class. I struggle with how I want gender identity to be a protected class. I just struggle with how to define it in a law or legislation in a way that doesn't become self-ID, because I don't support self-ID. But so some form of gender recognition, a process you have to go through, that you're legitimately trans, so that, because here's the thing, I need to be able to fire somebody who comes out as non-binary at my job, because I can't employ Delulu people.
Wow. Go ahead, Jeff. Yeah.
I shouldn't be firing somebody because they're trans because of a medical experience that they have and a different way they want to live their life. Those aren't the same thing. And so I would just want to find a way to protect one without opening the whole rainbow. Everything is in and now, because once you do that, it's very hard to even say, how could you legally separate the born biologically male sex offender from the women's prison? If you have unambiguous self-ID protections in law, I don't know how you could do that. And there has to be a way to protect actual trans people in discrimination law without totally opening the floodgates. And that's what I would support.
I think there is a way. I think what you're identifying, you're seeing all of these excesses, right? And you're saying that, like, clearly people are going to chafe against these excesses when they're forced on them. But you also want to protect people in some way. And I'm not like a crazy ANCAP radical libertarian person.
Nor am
so
I
also support some set of protections. But what I think is happening here in the law is a lot of those excesses are actually downstream from the current way in which we legislate these. So, like, right now, when discrimination suits are brought against companies, one of the things that the judge will ask is this company following best practices to reduce discrimination in the workplace? And companies are kind of finding themselves in an arms race where, as some companies adopt more and more progressive HR policies and, techniques, affinity groups for gay or Hispanic or Black employees, as companies adopt all of these policies, that becomes a best practice. And so failure to follow then becomes a legal liability. And so what I see is all of this ambiguity in how the law is structured, which causes companies to radically overshoot. Part of that is, legal fees. There's fee shifting, which makes civil discrimination suits extremely costly for the defendants. And so, I even disagree a little bit with Brianna, and maybe even you a little bit. I think that if you have a super PAC and people occasionally joke and they say F slur or T slur or whatever, they're using these words. I think there are instances in which individuals can decide for themselves that I'm okay with that kind of workplace environment as long as it's in good spirit. And people
quit if they really don't like it and go somewhere else.
They can quit. And I think it's okay if people sort of self-organize, find groups that match their own preferences, and they go and they find their people. But I think what's happening right now is if you are that steelworker at the mill in Gary, Indiana, right? You don't have the option to go and, go to a job site and be like, what, I'm fine with things. You can call me a tranny or whatever, and I'll call you a Polak or whatever. And, that's how a lot of men bond. I think that they should be allowed to do that. And I think that part of making that happen is just relaxing some of these regulations just a little. So if we remove the best practices standard or make the law a little bit less ambiguous, maybe a little bit less punitive, I think you would see companies relax some of those excessive, hyper-progressive policies.
I think they are already, to some extent.
Yes.
A lot of companies are rolling back DEI stuff.
I think so. And that's why, you mentioned, it's unlikely that these civil rights laws change. I actually think that it's very likely that under the next Trump administration, these things are going to get ruled on by the Supreme Court, and we're going to have a relaxing of these standards, which, frankly makes me optimistic, because a lot of the things that are currently being pushed in the media landscape, a lot of the power that's given to activists, which I think ultimately hurts us as trans people who we care about our core rights of bodily autonomy. I don't want to force everyone on earth to have to use these or pronouns. That's just, that doesn't help me to force. So I think that relaxing those standards a little bit might make people a lot less hostile, hopefully. And again, I think it's really horrible and tragic that you see Republicans now also trying to regulate these things. They're trying to change the line in the sand, but they're still believing that the government needs to put that line.
Well, that's one of my big complaints with kind of what I would call populist MAGA, a wing of the Republican Party now, is basically we'll do big government, but we'll make it patriotic, and it will be we'll force things and push down our vision. And it's they don't seem to realize that. I've even seen some conservative writers be like, we need to expand the regulatory state, but just put conservatives in charge of it. And I'm at some point they
just want their own government handouts.
I mean, even some of the economic policies, they're well, we just want our turn as the welfare queens. Give us this stuff for our pet interests. And obviously that's just totally anathema to my belief system. But I think it's just a problem in politics. People are deeply tribal. Most people aren't committed to ideology or principles in any real sense, especially those who run for office. One of the theories that informs my school of thought is public choice theory, right? And the idea that the people who seek the highest levels of government power are by their very nature the people least suited to exercise that power, because who is drawn to being a politician? I think I would actually be a pretty good senator, but I could never get elected as a senator.
It's a horrible job, though, Brad. You have no idea how bad it is running for office.
I have heard.
It is so bad. I was 100 pounds heavier because I sat in this chair, spending 8 hours a day calling random people, asking for money. It hurts your marriage. Like, I remember this time I was out at this event and I'm looking at this guy and I'm like, what is his name? I know his name. What is his name? And it was my husband. That's how tired I was.
Wow.
Like, talking to you. But I want to make sure we get some other opinions here. Because, Kate, I know, like me, you've been a project manager. So I want to see, do you agree with Taft's assessment about kind of teams, like that free-flowing thing? Do you think having an HR process has value? Kind of how do you feel about what she was saying?
So I transitioned before any protections at all, right? Mm-hmm. And when I talked to HR, I'd only worked there for a few months, and I had very little value. I was a neophyte, completely expendable. So I came to my HR department like a partner, like an equal, with a plan. I thought through things. I compromised on many things in order to make it as easy as possible for them to accommodate me. And it was just this very human discussion with my HR department. And I tell you what, 20 years later, it has never come up at work. Because we just got on with it, and I try to demonstrate my value in other ways. I do agree with Taft in that, and Brad and others, that placing language with policy is just a bad idea. It's steal your word, anathema, Brad, I love the word. It is anathema to who we are as Americans. Language should be free. And let society, let public discourse decide on the way these things fall out. We're never gonna win by forcing language. Now, basic constitutional rights, yes, please. But that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah, and the other thing is, there really is a business value to having strong protections for employees, right? And there's going to be some segment of trans people and gay people and black people and all sorts of people who like that when they go to work, there's an affinity group for them, right? Mm-hmm. And they like that they can go to HR and they like these strong protections. I think that's fantastic. And companies are going to offer those things to employees because they know that it's one way to recruit and retain talent from minority populations. So I think all the more power to these companies who are doing that. And, if they want to do that and they want to attract the employees who really value those things. And then if there's another company that wants to relax the standards a little bit, the people who prefer the relaxed standards can go there. And that's,
I was going to say, I get what you're saying, but for me personally, if I saw that a company had gay affinity groups, I'd be like, I don't think
it would not be yours.
Same.
The free market, right, can sort that out. What I would push back on is the Ron DeSantis wing of the Republican Party would want to ban them from basically that.
Yes.
Right? And say you can't stop woke act, right, that got struck down by courts for violating the First Amendment. They're basically trying to do woke legislative policing, but anti-woke. And no, just let individuals sort by what they believe in and what they want is my default position on all of these issues, really, because that's how I see it.
Yeah, the government just sucks at regulating these things.
All right, so I got a question for you, Brad. So this is a little spicy. I hope I can ask you a spicy question.
Go for it.
So I went and got some gorgeous boots downtown in Boston the other day. And so I go to downtown Boston. I go down to, near the Prudential Center. So the fancy part of Boston. And as I park my car down there and I'm walking down the street, I run into not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, but no, it was 5 different FTM trans people, trans men, right? And I'd never, I just don't run into them that much in my life. Boston has a large student population, and it was really obvious they were trans men. They were shorter, but they had beards, and they were just obviously trans men. So I guess my question to you is, as I was talking to one of them that was selling me some boots, like he had like sparkly fingernail polish, like exactly like a gay man, and some long, beautiful hair. So I guess for you, like, I feel like we talk so much about the other way, like would straight men be comfortable with dating trans women? So I want to ask you, as a gay man, would you be comfortable dating a FTM trans man? Because a lot of them are interested in men.
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I mean, no shade to anyone who does, and
Sure.
that just no, because for me, the anatomy would not be. Gender is, people talk a lot about whether gender is a spectrum. Sexuality is actually a spectrum, right? Very, or at least there's people who are 100% straight and 100% gay, but a lot of people are somewhere in the middle. And I would put myself at like the 95% gay. So, well, no, but it's actually an interesting concept because some gay men would be like, and I don't want to TMI anyone here, physically incapable of having a sex with a woman, right? So when you think about like back when they used to marry women and still have children and everything, some gay men literally couldn't do that. I could do that, right? And I think a lot of gay men could do that, but it just, and obviously a gay man dating a trans man is not the same thing as that. It's different because you're going to be more attracted to them. Even sometimes I have encountered like a content creator, an influencer who's a trans man who in the first glance I'm like, oh, he's cute. And then I find out that they're trans, and I just don't think that upon learning that information I'd still be interested. I've also been off the market for almost 6 years. Yeah. And so it's never come up for me, but I guess my gut says no, but I understand that for some people who are just a little bit more fluid or a little bit more on the spectrum in terms of what they're into, it's a no-brainer and they're fine with it. And yeah, to me, the only thing that I bristle at is sometimes the fringe trans types will be like, genital preferences are transphobic.
Yeah.
No. I can tell you, like, for me, receptive sex is very important for me and a partner. And that's, like, for me, it's kind of weird because what I love about some trans men is there's a wonderful emotional richness to them and a sensitivity that I find really attractive in men, right? So I could see running into someone like that, but it's like for me to enjoy myself in the bedroom, like I have a vagina and there's stuff I like and there's stuff I want. So I think I 100% with you with the needing certain parts to enjoy sex. I think it's so interesting because like, have you seen in gay culture, like the same discussion about FTMs kind of encroaching over on gay men's spaces the same way that we're seeing lesbians talk about trans women in those spaces?
I think there's a difference that like gay men who aren't into trans men just keep it moving. Just you know what I mean? They just swipe left.
Just keep it moving.
Yeah. They just move on.
Women write a blog post.
Well, but to give those women a little bit of their due, male violence towards females is a much more prevalent and real thing than female violence towards males. So I never feel threatened or endangered by a trans man. Now, most trans women wouldn't make a woman feel unsafe. There are some who I can understand why a woman might feel intimidated or unsafe or feel like they're interacting with a man. I'm thinking of the It's Ma'am person from GameStop.
Oh.
If I was speed dating and I was a lesbian woman and this person sat across from me, I'd feel like, okay, this is a male. I could understand why they might feel much more trepidation about it than I do with as long as a trans man is disclosing that that's what they are and they're on Grindr, I'd just be like, not for me. The same way I might have other preferences, right? Just keep it moving and it wouldn't affect me. But I can see why it might be a little different for lesbians and there's just a whole nother dynamic between women and males that they perceive that I'm not going to sit here and totally invalidate.
Sure. Sky, did you have any questions? Kate, I want to give some other people some chance to jump in here.
I had more of just a comment on something I noticed that I really like about your show is the emphasis on free speech. And I think it really ties into what we've been talking about here with the genital preferences, our transphobic thing. It's just this whole, I don't know. I've long been uncomfortable by the, cultural elements of the LGBT movement gaining traction, and the pronoun pins is a great example of this, where it's what you put on your pin is what you're supposed to be called or whatever, or announcing your pronouns, the preferred pronouns thing. At work. And it's funny because I had a coworker who was actually planning to transition but hadn't transitioned yet, make a comment about they didn't want to announce their pronouns because it would have a way of outing them. And so it's interesting to me how the cultural elements, I guess, of the LGBT movement sort of backfire on themselves. And this is very much where again, what you've done with your channel and your work really criticizes this effectively, I think. And so I didn't have a particular question here. I think we've hit on all the questions that I was basically thinking of, but
I get what you're saying. I actually had, just the other day, I'm doing an event with a liberal-leaning group that they're putting on, and I had a Zoom call where everyone except me said their pronouns during the introduction going around. And I was like, this is...
I hate it.
That's such a stupid ritual, because no one on this call is trans. We all know that no one on this call is trans. We all already know each other's pronouns that we want to be called, and I feel like if there was a trans person, they would probably feel put on the spot by this. Yes. And also, they'd probably hope that we don't need to be told to know what pronouns they're to be called. If I didn't know any one of you and I saw you on a Zoom call, I would kind of assume to call you she, her. And if you came and said my pronouns are she, her, then you'd probably make me think about it more than I otherwise would.
Yeah, 100%.
The whole thing felt because
my pronouns, please.
Yeah, that's the whole reason I had all that surgery, so you could assume my pronouns.
The whole thing felt like such a cultural ritual that the real goal of it had nothing to do with trans people, but simply about virtue signaling to signify we're good progressives, we're part of the good tribe. And I'm like, I'm not going to participate. And it might be awkward if at the actual event, if they all ask pronouns, I'm just not going to participate. I'm not going to say, give them a hard time about it, but I think it's weird to do that.
Yeah, I think we agree.
Can I ask you a very serious question?
Sure.
How has your mission to normalize the term delulu been?
I was the first person that I can see, and I searched the records for exactly 0 minutes. I was the first person to say the word delulu on cable television. On Fox News. So I think it's going good. I certainly didn't invent it. I just think it's a funny term. And I like saying to people that their Delulu is showing.
I love it. Is our Delulu showing today? Or
no, I think you guys make a lot of sense from what we...
we all have a bit of it somewhere.
That's right. Get to know us better, and you'll think we're a little Delulu.
I'm just an open person in that I've always, and this is actually kind of sad, even since 2018, 2019, when I first started my career, I wanted to have more conversations or dialogues or even just friendships or connections with LGBT influencers or commentators or journalists who were left of center, but almost all of them, I'd go to look them up and I'd be blocked. And I'm like, I've never interacted with this person. I've never said anything negative to me. They just must have seen my opinions and not wanted to hear them. And it's interesting because at the time, some of the things I was saying, like opposing child transitioning, medical transition, I'm fine with social transition, they were minority opinions. And now they've become much more commonly held opinions. And now it's like, you tried to ignore us and it didn't make the thing that you disagreed with go away. in fact, it just continued to grow. And that's one of the problems with kind of trapping yourself in an echo chamber, which is what a lot of these LGBT, especially the nonprofits, which, boy, I think are so financially suspect and corrupt, and so self-serving, and have actually, at this point, so many of them have done so much more harm than good. I mean, GLAAD pisses me off. GLAAD just recently declared homosexual an offensive term. The gay community.
No, you can't say gay community anymore. You can say trans community.
You have to refer to. You have to refer to, if you're talking about gay men, you have to say LGBTQ plus men. I saw this video on TikTok, which tells you what my algorithm shows me, right? It's like 10 hottest LGBTQ men in the world. And I assumed there was going to be a trans man on the list, because why else would they have said LGBTQ? It was 9 gay men and 1 bi man. And I'm like, so these are LGBTQ plus men. There's no such thing as an LGBTQ plus man, because you can't be all of those things and a man. Like, it doesn't make sense. And I don't think they should be racing or problematizing gay people in the name of some sort of community cohesion.
Brad, this drives me crazy, because you'll see this in headlines all the time too, where it will be like LGBT rights under attack, and I'll be like, oh, I guess they're going after all of us. And you read the story, it's like, nope, just the trannies today. So
yeah, well, this is something that's hard, because
I think it's okay for us to have different cultures. Like, gay male culture is its own thing. And I say that as someone who spent plenty of time in it, right? Like, it's drag queens and golden girls and just other stuff. And it's Grindr, and it's its own thing. Yeah, didn't want to say anything. But yeah, it's just different. And I think it's okay for us to, like, where I don't want to say a problem is, I often feel frustrated, because I can tell you, as someone that did the work to help gay marriage get passed, I helped raise money, I pressured, I was out there doing protests, I called my congressman, as a Democratic operative, I did a lot of work on that. It does feel to me in some ways like I think we're different, but it's hard for me not to feel resentful sometimes, like in this really dire moment where we need our gay brothers and sisters to step up and help us. It kind of feels like a lot of you are looking out for yourselves and talking about like transphobia, like it's this edgy new thing that you're just discovering. It's like, no, I wish that there was a little bit more solidarity, but I also understand how the fringe activists have pushed the discussion so hard, particularly in the lesbian spaces, that it's hard for there to be that goodwill there. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. I think I've always would have felt, and I to be clear, like I said, I have stuck my neck out, and I will continue to, but that's because I've always just not minded saying an unpopular thing. But I think what's happened with a significant number of gay men, but particularly like online gay men, is that they've just totally rejected trans. They've totally turned their back. You're right. There's no sense of defense or loyalty whatsoever. But I think that's because of the face of trans that they've been presented with online, which is not necessarily representative. But when that Eli person that you're on Piers Morgan with, who's literally illegally sending medicine for, I think, this to
it is 100% true
about it. Yes. When that's the face of the trans community, or if the face of the trans movement is California putting biologically male SA offenders in women's prisons, right? I can understand why people are like, oh, nothing to do with me. Now, the problem I have is like that's kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But if the trans movement had always been legitimate transsexual people, and not kind of the Q plus nonsense, I think you would have encountered that less of that kind of abandonment or total kind of, honestly, some of the gay right-wing people I see on Twitter are actually come across as hateful against trans people now. Yeah. I find that sad. I had to unfollow several who were mutuals because they're just posting there is an obsession with trans people that I understand when it's politicians or activists, but there's these accounts that just post like images of an ugly trans person, and it's just a person they found somewhere on Instagram that posted an image of themselves, and they'll just be like, the text of the Libs of TikTok tweet will be like, "This is a man."
Yeah.
What is the point of this beyond cruelty? You know, there was a very interesting divide on the right, because I am not a fan of Dylan Mulvaney. However, Matt Walsh did a monologue about Dylan Mulvaney that was one of the nastiest and most dehumanizing little bits of rhetoric I've seen in a long time, and I and many others spoke out about it against it at the time. Like, listen, you can even believe that Dylan Mulvaney is a man and not be so nasty and vitriolic. I mean, I think he called Dylan alien and like basically subhuman, and it was a very interesting divide between people on the right who still had empathy and compassion and were able to say, that's wrong to treat people that way, even people you think are bad or harmful, and people who are like, no, this is war, and the TQ are after kids, anything goes. I will never believe anything goes in any walk of life, because I have my own principles, and I'd rather. Sometimes people on the far right will accuse me of being a loser because I want to like play by the rules, or I won't censor somebody because they disagree with me, and they're like, no, we have to censor them back. This is war. I'm like, I actually would rather lose, if that by their definition, than become the thing I'm supposed to be fighting against in order to defeat it, because then you haven't defeated it at all. You've just replaced it with another version of itself and compromised yourself in the process.
You know, Brad, I just want to say, I saw that video that Matt Walsh did on Dylan Mulvaney, and it broke me a little bit to see how mean he was and just how awful, and like you said, he was like basically describing him as subhuman. And then it hit me, you know, if I'm feeling this way, there's a dozen other people that are watching the same thing and feeling the exact same way. And so in an ironic twist, it's almost helping bring back a little bit of that sympathy for trans people, because of how like crazy the right wing side has sort of kind of gone off the rails in their own way of criticizing people just on their looks and just picking them apart and
just having no standards. Like, I just called out a bunch of right-wing influencers who are rehabbing Andrew Tate.
Yes, I saw you doing that. Thank you.
Some of these people have no integrity or principles or values beyond what will get them attention, and it's kind of a spinning circle with like the Matt Walshes of the world. They get noticed the most when they go into new extreme territory. Matt Walsh calling a trans woman a man is something he does every day. So that's not going to get him coverage from Media Matters that will then get denounced by all the liberal media, but in process garnering him way more attention. So he has to take it to a new extreme. It's kind of this vicious feedback loop. He has to do something new attacking Dylan Mulvaney to make it noticeable and to get attention for it. And it's been a very successful business model for people like him in the Daily Wire. I try to do a similar style of content in terms of infotainment, but without that toxicity. And it's been a slower build, but it is successful now on YouTube for me.
And the difference is you're someone with integrity that I respect. Right. They're not. So last question. This is someone we ask everyone on Dollcast. This is the big question. Brad, are traps gay?
What is a trap in this context? Like, you don't know that it's a straight man gets with a trans woman and doesn't know it's a trans woman?
Taft, do you want to drop that?
Yeah, I mean, like, trap, I think, is like a term that shows up on like message boards on like the early internet to refer to a character that is trans, but you wouldn't like know it looking at them. So the question sort of like memed on over decades. Straight men have debated this in, you know, every hollowed hall of 4chan there is. Is it gay to be attracted to a trap?
To a passing trans
And they
woman.
join your soccer team. If a guy's like, yeah, I saw
what I've always said about men who are interested in trans women is it's not the same thing as gay, right? Because I wouldn't be interested in a trans woman, even if they're technically bio male at birth or whatever, because they're so many in ways present female and their secondary sex characteristics, and that's a huge part of sexual attraction. So it's not gay, but it's also not the straightest thing in the world. So I've always said it's just a little bit in between. It's a little bit on the bi spectrum, maybe, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it.
There you go.
I think of myself as a very, very spicy heterosexual, so there it is. So
I love it.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, Brad. This is such a good time. I'm such a huge fan of your work, and we gotta keep this going. I always love seeing you.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming on.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Do we want to wrap up with the final story that we were talking about?
The final story?
Pariah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
That's right. Okay, yeah. So for our final segment today, we're going to talk about Pariah the Doll's detransition video. Yeah, it was loaded and had a lot of religious overtones to it, but also very provocative, especially with the connection with Milo Yiannopoulos. I hope I said his name right.
My good buddy Milo.
Oh, you know him.
Best friends, yes.
Wow. So
we hate each other.
Yeah,
Each other for a long time.
they're very different people.
We got added into a group chat. It was just like instant hating each other after 10 years. It was great.
Oh gosh. Well, okay. I will say I saw it before I saw the shave, the buzz cut video that they released. Also, did you all see that one?
I did.
Yeah. That kind of changed it a little bit for me. So,
In what sense?
like I thought it was a little bit more genuine at first. I mean, it comes across. I mean, I want to say she, but I guess he really just. You know, it felt emotional and I felt sad. It was very genuine coming across. But then when I saw that buzz-cutting video, I was like, oh, I don't know. Like, now this looks like it's part of some, like, I don't know, just agenda of some kind, and I just can't see all of it.
I felt like a stunt to you, I guess.
Yes! I wanted to believe it was sincere, but now I'm like, social media, it's all a game, right? Like,
is it? I mean, I do social media to do things I believe in, but I also get the sense that's not the only paradigm out there. Kate, I guess I wanted to ask you because you're closer to my age. Like, have you ever in your entire life had a second of seriously thinking about detransitioning? Because I haven't. Like I got on estrogen and I'm just like, this is it. Like, I've never regretted or thought about it ever. So it's hard for me to understand. Eden, I mean, how do you feel?
I feel like detransition in general is just a result of lowering the bar for transition itself.
Yeah.
If it's a life or death situation, if it is the last hope that someone has, they're going to cling to it, and it'll continue to be a flotation device for them throughout the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
But if the bar is quite low and people are just putting things on like an outfit, it's not surprising that they get sick of a particular outfit one day and try to put something else on. I'm not surprised by the number of detransitioners at present. I think everyone is a little bit tragic, and certainly the female to male is more tragic, simply because of the permanence of testosterone. But yeah, no, I'm not surprised. I've never encountered such a thing back in the day.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been a thing.
Yeah. How do you feel about it, Taff?
I reached out to Miles, who used to go by Salome, like years ago, to do an interview. And I found out about him through his Substack. And he was saying kind of like radical, maybe even kind of, I don't know, even slightly racist things on there. And I found it fascinating that here was this person who was a trans woman and a model in New York, and someone who is singing at a professional level as well in the female register, And they're also writing these like radical and strange things online. And so I reached out and I did an interview with him way back then. And it was really interesting. The entire interview, we just talked about his Twitter profile. Like not just his Twitter profile, just his Twitter bio, because it had maybe like 5 things in it. And we just went thing by thing, talk to me about everything about this. And even then, I was struck by the sense that Miles had a really deep religious conviction, really believed in the Catholicism that they practiced. And this was also like deeply, deeply at odds with their trans identity. So I think what they talk about in the video, you know, feeling like they had to choose between the transness and God. I think I'm not surprised that they chose God based on what I know about him. I think it's something you probably could have seen coming. But I also think it's unique in that I think there probably is something like very deep and underlying and biological about their transness that isn't going to go away. And so I think that they're going to be like struggling with that forever. And I hope they find what they're looking for in God, in their relationship with Milo. I can like only hope the best for them, but it does like worry me as well, because I just don't know if they're going to be like happy long term. And maybe like in a way I would be like, it would be nice if it was just like kind of a stunt and you know they had more clarity on like what they were doing, and it was just like a temporary thing that, you know, maybe then they would like really commit to religion or to transness or, you know, whatever it is. But I do, in that video, I think I get the sense of someone who is kind of like lost and still finding their way.
I agree.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say that, because the speculation on like how they're going to manage, I mean, if gender dysphoria was a part of their story, I mean, that's what I sort of wonder, and where I think the speculation here comes from, because he doesn't talk about it in the video at all, I think, about like what led to that decision to transition in the first place. So now detransitioning as a means of, I guess, being more honest with people. That was a theme in the video, at least, like that they're not, that he's not like being dishonest when people refer to him as a woman or an actress. And I found that compelling. But also I was like you said, you know, where does this go now? Because does that mean you're going to keep your hair short and you're going to go on testosterone and all these things? Like what does detransition mean in this context?
Might still be taking estrogen.
Okay.
I'm planning to continue doing that, which is why like some people were kind of memeing on the video and saying things like, oh, you know, like all you've done is like cut your hair and this is like so dramatic. And that's, you know, the most womanly thing you could do is cut your hair short and then have your mercy break down.
So it almost sounds more like it's what I've also been seeing more online, I think, lately too, which is like an ideological detransition, where it has a lot more to do about your self-conception and less about like physical appearance or taking hormones. I mean, granted, they shaved their heads, so there is that.
But in which case, then like I would also be detransitioned. If it's like ideological. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I think that they'll like figure it out eventually. But I don't know. Milo is kind of an interesting, chaotic character.
Oh, he's so awful. He's so bad faith. He's so narcissistic. He has nothing interesting to say. He's just a broken person. Like, I can get along with a lot of people, but he's just a bad human being in my view. But what I wanted to say is this is, look, again, next week we have John Michael Bailey on, and I'm sure we will get into the problematic and somewhat questionable age LGBT, AGP versus HSTS typology, of which I am kind of unconvinced it's completely there. But what I have heard is my friends, don't want to say their name, I have a good friend that's told me this, that what happens for people that are more autosexual and they detransition is they have to stay on that estrogen because the stuff that made them transition in the first place comes back if they try to get off of that. So I would be very interested. Like, I can't see Pariah like being happy, like going back on T and trying to live as a man. That's just really hard for me to see. So I don't know.
I will say, I think Salome or like Miles, one of the only trans women who I had ever met who I thought like, you know,
yeah,
I would like totally, you know, if you like fell into the HSTS category, I would totally believe that for you.
Yeah.
I think mostly I meet trans women who I think feel AGP or they don't feel like either necessarily, but she definitely presented as like a gay guy who had transitioned.
100%.
And so, yeah. I think she, if anything, falls into that category. And obviously, I don't know like what goes on in her brain. Maybe she's like the most AGP person alive. But just like in terms of presentation, they seemed like HSTS,
oh my gosh,
whatever that means.
I mean, can't you see in this political climate? I'd love to know what you think of this, Kate. Like, can't you see in this political climate? Because I think you're so right when you say, you know, like for us, you had to really, 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 really want it. So the people that transitioned in her era were the like extreme cases. But can you not see a lot of people that just get to be exhausted with the political conversation? And it's just like the mental barrage of being in this social media world right now. Can you not see a lot of people just going like, yeah, I just give up? I mean, I think this is going to happen more and more, actually.
I miss the silence. You know? The silence on all these issues was just lovely.
Wonderful.
Just get on with it.
Yeah.
And there are people working behind the scenes on policy improvements and anti-discrimination, and they were working their butts off, I'm sure, but it was quiet, and we all loved it.
Yeah.
But no, it's different. One of the things I wanted to expound on when I was thinking about way back then, there was a lot of self-hatred associated with transition back then, and that held people back. Once that self-hatred is no longer an oppressive force, yeah, you're going to see more people transition. And I think, you know, obviously getting that load off of people's back is just an amazing thing. Self-hatred is probably one of the worst crippling things that anyone can deal with in life, and it drives you, in most extreme cases, to suicide. So yeah, get rid of that. Open, you know, let people explore their gender, but yeah, transition is going to be part of it.
Yeah.
Whenever there's an expansion of liberty, you have mistakes made. But if you trust people, if you believe fundamentally that people deserve to be able to make their own decisions, we have to, as a society, expect a little bit of that. And this is true whether it's Second Amendment or freedom of speech or the right for an adult to manage their own body.
Correct. Yeah. And this is where, like, also when it comes to the concept of detransition, I like it being framed as part of, for me at least, as part of someone's journey, as opposed to it being a necessarily regretful decision off of their transition. Because I just don't think, like, if I was to ever detransition, I do think about this sometimes from the basis of the long-term medical aspect of being on HRT. Otherwise, I'm completely happy. And like Brianna said, I would never, ever consider it. But let's say like I had a blood clot or something and estrogen was a problem or something. And then this, I don't know, presented itself as a problem. I would never think that my detransition means that like transition didn't help me in the first place. Like it was absolutely essential for me managing my gender dysphoria. And I will always say that. And it's like, if I ever did have a detransition, it would be in that same course of critical decision making based on what I have to do to manage my situation. And so that's where, like, I also would be so curious to hear more from Miles. Like, do you regret your transition at all, or do you feel like it helped you reach where you got today?
So I wanted to ask you, Sky, like, I consider, like, I am religious, but I'm not, I wouldn't say, how can I put this? I'd love to know how you feel about this too, Kate, but for me, it's like I grew up in a really religious household, right? And when I transitioned, I turned really, really atheist, really, really aggressively, just because, like, back in these days, there was no space for trans people to be, like, religious, right? It was very much the religious right versus LGBT. Turned against it really hard. And then after I got past the transition part and put my anger aside, I was a lot more able to look at this and be like, no, this structure has value. This belief has value. This principle of grace towards others has value. But there's admittedly always been a distance there, because I never feel like the church is ever going to really enthusiastically be behind my husband. So, you know, when I go to church, it's like, oh, Brianna Wu, the local person who's well known, is going to church, but it's not, like, do you know what I mean? It's more of an event than, like, a community, because I can't be anonymous the same way I could as a child. So I don't know. I see this, and I see pariah detransitioning because of religious reasons. And I see that, and I go, well, that doesn't have anything to do with any of the religious lessons I learned or anything I find valuable from religion. Like, so I guess as the person on the show who I consider you to be more like faith to have a bigger component in your life than mine, how do you kind of take that? Like the religious pressure internal being such a big part of why they decided to move away from this. Like, do you ever feel like you're living in sin? Because I don't. Like, I think God made me this way, and I have to deal with it. I think that's the challenge of my life.
Ooh, yeah. very loaded question, but it's
is it loaded?
Good.
Is it loaded? I'm trying to be neutral, or how do you?
I mean, it's just that the content of it is so heavy.
Yeah.
In terms of, like, growing up in a religious household that absolutely would have considered. I mean, there were derogatory comments about gay people all the time, because they, from my, you know, I don't want to say from who exactly, but from people I grew up with, because of it being considered sin, and etc. And I think the big shifting point for me, because I did struggle with thinking, oh yeah, this is sin. Like, this is a bad part of me, this gender dysphoria I'm feeling. I need to be happy with who I am. And ultimately, I think it was a gift, because it gave me the impetus to challenge my, like, natural inclinations, my own thinking. But ultimately, the shift for me was realizing that it's really a medical issue when it comes to how I'm navigating my daily life, because I can't interact with things, or I just can't, like, exist and do well at anything without having disruption and thoughts about my gender becoming a problem, because it became a bigger problem over time. And so, like, from looking at scripture, because that's, like, the basis of how Christians, you know, will make decisions and live their life, is scripture. I came to see, like, okay, yes, God created me as a male, and that is never going to change, and that's okay. Like, I can accept that reality. But God has also told us to be good stewards of our bodies and ourselves. And quite frankly, gender dysphoria was causing me to be a bad steward of myself and all of those ways, besides just rendering me ineffective in so many other capacities. And so I think what really shifted for me was, again, that viewpoint of seeing it more as a disability, as something to be managed, and then seeing, like, technology as the means by which, you know, we can, in this day and age, we have more options available to us to make it through that struggle through medical transition. And this is where, like, these detransition videos of people that are detransitioning for religious reasons really, it rubs me the wrong way, because it's like, well, what about the Christian that is transitioning? Like, does that mean their faith is invalid now because you're interpreting it this way? Like, scripture can be interpreted a lot of different ways. And this is where I always come back to when it's like, you got to be really careful with like rigid readings out of scripture. And I don't know. I think it has a lot more to do with the heart, and God judges the heart. That's what he says in scripture. And that's what Jesus is about your heart. And so I think like your heart can absolutely be in the right place and be transitioning. Like the two are not at odds.
Yeah. Kate, did you grow up in a religious house at all, or did you struggle with this at all?
Yeah, I grew up in a fairly devout Catholic home. My mom was literally a nun, like ex-nun, but a nun. She got divorced from the church and the Pope. It's papal decree, they have to sign off and things. So she's still very devout, and one of the biggest things that helped her through my transition, again, this is a long time ago, but was her priest. She went to her priest, and her priest just taught her about goodness and humanity and morality, and continued to emphasize with her on this medical situation not impacting those things. I went through a different journey. I think transness was a significant component to me becoming atheist. Honestly, I mean, there were times. I don't know if you've ever read the book The Sparrow. It's one of my favorite books.
I've read that. Fantastic science fiction.
Yeah.
What is this about?
Oh, it's so good.
Yes.
It's about the Jesuits who they end up traveling to a distant planet, and it deals deeply with themes of religion.
Oh my gosh. I remember when I hit that part, and I'm not going to spoil it because honestly it's brilliant, but there's this one part back toward the end of the book where everything came into question for me. And I remember sitting there screaming, wailing in my car at an airport because I couldn't leave the airport. I had to finish this book. And I screamed and cursed God to the extreme. And that I've been building, for decades, since I was a child. And that book got it out, I tell you what. It was a fight for me, and I'm not saying that being atheist at this point in my life is the right choice for me. Who knows? Frankly, I'm agnostic, but anyway, I grew up in it and still exist in it when I go home.
Yeah. Toph, are you religious at all? How do you kind of feel?
I'm not religious. I think I'm, fairly solidly in the atheist camp. Very, very influenced by Nietzsche and his writings on religion. So it's kind of where I tend to come at it from. But I'm interested in religion, and I've been reading the Bible, still working through it. I read ahead, and then I've come back recently to the book of Jeremiah, which is fantastically.
That's a good one.
It's so intense, and it's interesting to read and be like, oh, I really like how this section is written, or I don't super like how that section is written. So I have a lot of respect for religion, and I'm sort of fascinated by it, and I think it's important to understand deeply. But I also, when I think about Miles and his detransition, it makes sense to me, and I can imagine someone who's very into Catholicism specifically. Skylar, I don't know what denomination of Christian you are.
Growing up, it was always non-denominational, but effectively it's evangelicalism.
Because I think that Protestants also have a very different view on this. The relationship with God is much more personal, and I think from the Protestant perspective, it makes more sense to kind of be well, I have my personal relationship with God, and it entails these sorts of things. Maybe transition is a part of that relationship. But I think for someone like Miles, who is very much on the Catholic side of things, it's kind of you're either part of the Catholic Church or you're not. And he takes those Catholic precepts very seriously. And so if there's prohibitions against transition from a Catholic perspective, I think that's a lot harder to justify. Like, it's probably a big tension. I don't know if you found this to be true in your transition, Kate, because yeah, it's hard to marry Catholicism with that. And your mother, I'm so glad that she had like a priest to navigate her through that, to approach you with like kindness and empathy. But from like a personal perspective, it's totally different to have like agency over your transition and to be sort of forced with that tough decision.
Sure, it's fun. I married a devout Christian, although he tends towards more Calvinist from a literal Bible perspective.
Yeah.
You know, it's a funny thing, balancing religion with transness. I don't think I hope people come to terms with it at some point and find their little slice of peace. I'm not the one to guide through that, unfortunately.
Sometimes I think you can find like peace in the tension of the two in a way. It's weird to say, but it's like that's sort of what I found is like I'm happiest when I'm not in just one group or the other, when I'm like tethered in between, taking the best parts of each. That's just how, like, I don't know, I've always felt that way, because I feel like transitioning, even though we say like, or like I'll say like I'm a trans woman, but it's like transitioning is something you do too. Like you have to like medically transition, and so it's like I don't know, I feel like that ongoingness is part of like the element of where I want to hold everything in tension when it comes to my beliefs and what like scripture says and what people say, because the moment I stop holding it in tension, I'm a closed book. And I want to be like an open book and able to like adapt and understand like where I need to go next or what I should do.
I think that's amazing. Before we end this topic, I want to ask you, Kate, because I'm very Protestant. I'm very Presbyterian. If you're not familiar with that, we're kind of the hardcore, very formal, very storied, very like stiff rule following. Like we're not like Baptists or evangelicals at all. We're much more like, hey, here's the philosophy. We're gonna go do a 3-hour seminar on this so you can know exactly why you believe in predestination. That's kind of the culture. So help me understand, like with Catholicism, why would Pariah or Miles, I'm doing my best here, I apologize, but why would the Catholic Church make them feel all this pressure to detransition? Because it's hard, like I think it's exactly like you said, Taff. For me, because of the culture I grew up with, it's so my interpretation of the good in what I found and those values I bring in my life and the standards I hold myself to. Help me understand like an institution having that much power over your own identity, because that's really hard for me to conceive of.
It's difficult for me too. But it's generational in some families as well, and it's tied into culture and family culture, and with institutions like Catholicism, and probably to a similar degree aspects of Judaism. It's wildly mixed into your customs and your history, and if you feel like that's at risk, it's a big chunk of who you are. From a specifics perspective, I didn't see anything in particular that would drive me one way or the other, except for the sacrament of marriage, which is fairly stringent with respect to biological sex, to steal Brad's term. So that crushed my mom. You know, when she was like, "Oh, she's not going to be able to be married in the church," it didn't bother me so much. But that was probably the main thing, and that was the thing the priest couldn't compromise on because it's indoctrinated.
That's so hard. Oh my goodness. So I guess before we close the show out, Taff, I wanted to give just a minute to talk about this. You were telling us a story about leaving a Discord server this week. Do you want to kind of talk about that really quickly?
Yeah, I think I can talk about it. It's something that I don't necessarily know I have like the perfect language for. But I was friends with a group of people for a very, very long time. I started talking to them in like 2018. Spoke with them like every day of my life. Just incessantly shared everything with them. As there's many trans people in this group, so as people got like surgeries, they would post like surgery photos, and I got to see all of these people's transitions from beginning to end, and they got to see mine. And I don't know if there's so much of a story, but just in my life, I think I've sort of like grown apart from these people over time. I think part of that is my fault, because I think I've not always been like the best friend, and I think that I've often been dealing with my own things, my own problems, and that's led me to, be more quick to anger or to argument with people. And I think I have not always been the best at reaching out to people and deepening connections with them, or really showing like genuine interest in their lives. One of my 2025 like New Year's goals is to really become like deeply interested in people, to like really deeply care for them, and to practice that care. I think that's kind of the foundation of friendship.
Yeah.
But so I think there's over time like a sort of gap between me and these people developed, and I think it's been frustrating because as maybe the personal gap grew, tensions around politics have become like more intractable or difficult to deal with, or they've become nastier. And so even though like I don't usually have negative or personal feelings regarding political differences with people, I have noticed that like when there is a point of disagreement, it sometimes turns like really personal and really nasty very quickly.
Yeah.
And I noticed that like as far back as 2021, but I sort of didn't say anything or really stand up for myself. I think because at that time I dealt with a lot more self-image issues, and I didn't really believe that I could like find other friends, or I felt kind of like trapped, unable to speak my mind or stand up for myself. And now that I've dealt with a lot of those issues, I feel more comfortable just sort of putting distance between myself and this group of people, really just like a few people within the group. But it's been like hard emotionally to kind of like put that extra distance between myself and people that I really do genuinely continue to care about very deeply. And so I don't know, I'm continuing to navigate that. I don't know what it'll look like, but in my life, that's what I'm working on and going through.
I think it can really hurt when trans friendships blow up. Like it can really, really, really injure you in a way it doesn't. Like this is something like the whole girl friendship thing. Like that's a whole book, like learning how this works, because that's like one thing. But like sometimes like I have someone who I genuinely care about, and I thought we were really good friends in this Israel-Palestine thing. Like I'm on one side, and it has genuinely destroyed our friendship to a way that they've just been tremendously abusive to me. And I almost want to call her up and be like, can we just like it hurts me when she starts attacking.
But
no,
is it someone that we know?
I don't know if y'all know her. No.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think this is something I think about a lot, is I think like the purpose of Dollcast is I think we're trying to model some better friendship and social patterns for the community. And it's hard for me not to notice, like, I'd love to know if you've experienced this, Kate. Like, it's really hard for me to think of trans friendships I've had for like 10 years, right? Mm-hmm. It really feels like we tend to dip in and out of each other's lives. And it's weird because we have such a bizarre experience that you would think we would be extremely close. And instead, I think it's almost like we end up becoming the vessels for all this self-hate or neurosis that each other feels about stuff, or either we're like such damaged people that it's hard for us to have friendships long term. I don't know what it is, but it's like sometimes I talk to cis girls and they've had friendships since kindergarten, and I'm so jealous of that. Does that make sense to y'all?
My story is a little unique in that I actively stepped away from everything.
I did too.
I kept one friend with the same experience, but ironically, we never talked about it. It wasn't part of our friendship. Our friendship was just friendship based on common experiences. We were in our 20s together. She was at my wedding, I was at hers, but it wasn't a trans friendship. Mm-hmm. I recently connected last week with a group of women that really helped me through in the mid-2000s after I pulled away, but I still needed support and camaraderie. And we connected after 15, 20 years of not speaking. And it's been lovely. Oh my God. Like the families and the marriages and the education and the lives, just these amazing lives that all these women have lived. And I could not be happier reconnecting with them and getting to learn what their lives have turned into. But I've also lost some. I lost some that never recovered from me separating for so long.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like for me it was very similar to what you described of like pulling away. I did have a couple of friends that I managed to kind of keep through the transition and through the years, but I did lose some as well, and some really close friends too. But I think I found that it was kind of what you said, really with like when it comes to just not talking that much about being trans, I don't know, there's just not a lot that I have to talk about that I really have that I want to talk about there, as opposed to well, what do you do? What are your activities or what are your interests? That's where I'll gravitate a lot more naturally. Because I guess, part of transition, it depends on who you are, but for all of us, it's very true that we don't want being trans to be something that's part of our lives every day. Nope. So we're not looking to connect on that. We're looking to connect on other things. And so it ends up being do you have the same interests or not kind of deal.
I don't know though, because Kate, I really identified with what you said at the beginning of the show, where it was there was this unpacked box of trauma that you put away. Mm-hmm. Because for me, it really was I transitioned, I got on hormones, I came to the conclusion the community was too unhealthy to spend a lot of time in. And by the way, this is the 2004 version of the community, right? And I just very consciously left the community, did not talk about it. I went many, many years. I knew trans people occasionally, but I literally it's not that I was ashamed of who I was. It was just I wanted to focus on my own life and my own marriage and my career, and really was very conscious of building that. And I came back to it last year, and it's been very interesting because you, Kate, I was really unsure of how I felt about a lot of modern trans politics. I need to unpack non-binary stuff, or trans women that go non-op, or this AGP thing. I needed to figure out my positions there. In some ways, I don't mind just being vulnerable and saying y'all are deeply important people in my life, Taff and Sky. I really I feel like the show nourishes a part of me every single week, and I look forward to it in a way I don't other professional projects that I do. But it's also like the amount of headspace that I spend thinking about trans stuff is so much higher than it used to be. Yeah, I have really mixed feelings about that, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I never. I used to never think about trans things really, or for a long period in my life. I thought about trans things and I stopped. I made a conscious decision to sort of move away from that, and then I just didn't. And then I started this show, and now I talk about trans things weekly, and I think about it a lot more than I did previously. So I don't know. I think that there's a feeling of obligation in this moment in time to address these issues, to come back into talking about them, and to help make sense of things, especially when we've allowed people to speak for us for so long, activists, and oftentimes say things that aren't helpful to us.
Yeah.
So
I think it's duty. Go ahead.
Yeah, obligation, duty. I couldn't agree more. I am in a unique place here, I feel because I don't like the spotlight. I don't like being on podcasts, to be honest. The format is scary to me, but I love each of you. And I love the guests we have on, and I love what we talk about is fun. But I'm not the best speaker, and I don't even need to do this. And it's but I feel obligated deeply to help right the ship that has gone so wrong. And it's about to sink. It is so close. And I know, Bree, we've talked about this, and you've seen the writing on the wall, and I believe you, and I believe everyone here can see where things are going. You don't need to have a microscope to see that. It's easy. And so I just wanted to echo again and be I'm here for that exact reason. Because I want to help be the voice. I want to override the voices that have been speaking on our behalf for us for so long.
Kate, did you feel any responsibility to do that in kind of saying yes today? How do you feel about the way trans stuff has gone? Do you worry about the future? What's kind of your assessment of everything?
Of course I worry about the future, right? Although I didn't for a very long time. And, that is the best way to live, is just to get on with it. But when you're bombarded nonstop with talking heads on television and headline advertisements on newspapers, it gets to you. It eats away at you. Even if you're invisible and unaffected practically, it's a poison. And we have to purge the poison.
Yeah.
Because we are not ever going to be able to survive in a world that looks at us in that way. And I've lived in that world for a long time, but but I was born in a state where I could change my birth markers. I was born in a time when I have no internet presence prior to that. That doesn't exist. Except maybe on Napster or something like that.
I'm going to look you up on Napster. I'm going to find it.
Yeah, so I'm not worried about myself.
We'll be fine.
My conservative dad is that has nothing to do with you, right? But it does, and it has a lot to do with the next generation who are going to be fighting this publicly. With long histories on social media.
Yeah.
So, I felt obligated. Now, I'm still practically stealth in my day-to-day life. My in-laws don't even know. So
really?
I will resolve that issue probably shortly before it's resolved for me. But I've got a lot of coming out to do in the next whatever. If this becomes a thing, I'll have to resolve those issues.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Coming out?
Yeah.
Gross. Honestly.
It's awful. It's awful. I hate having these discussions now. It's awful.
Yeah.
I hate that I do media. It's the first thing people ask me about. I hate that Piers Morgan is not calling for me to talk about Israel-Palestine. He's asking me about trans stuff. I just hate it. I hate it.
Yeah, and it's anticipating being treated like other.
Yeah.
I haven't had to deal with for a very long time, but I remember, and I hated it back in the day when people, they're respectful, they're lovely, but they keep you at a distance. You are at arm's reach because you're other. And that is that eats away at me. And I'm kind of bracing for impact if that works its way back into my life.
But don't you feel like there's a cost to hiding it all the time? Like, I felt that as well. Like, the fact that I can't tell you how many times I was in meetings, someone would start going off on trans people, right? And you'd just be sitting there thinking, like, oh my goodness gracious. Like, you know, or seeing stuff and talking around it. Like, it's really challenging to keep that hidden. So it's like lose-lose, I think.
Yeah, the thing that bothers me the most is it's with close friends that don't know.
Yeah, 100%.
Not being whole is awful.
Yeah.
It's, does that affect what we talk about on a day-to-day basis? No. We have the same experiences in life, and my friends and I can talk for a million years on normal life stuff. But there's a context to being raised in the way we were raised that adds character and depth, and to set that aside and ignore it sucks. So, it is a double-edged blade. I don't know, but I'm bracing for impact to some degree.
Oh,
don't feel bad. I'll get over it.
You're tough. Come on.
Some days.
Yeah.
We all have our days, right?
Amazing.
Yeah.
Taff, did you have anything else you wanted to say on that?
Nothing else.
All right.
Okay. All right. Okay. We're going to wrap up the show. All right. Well, got kind of sobering there at the end, but otherwise was pretty happy. So anyways, just wanted to thank all our listeners for tuning in today and all our viewers for watching us. Just want to say, if you want to check us out and get a little bit more into the mix, you can find us at dollcastshow.com. Again, that's dollcastshow.com. And until next time, stay fabulous.